Welcome, everybody. Uh, actually, one. Okay, thank you. um, this is the Portland Planning Sustainability Commission's April 9th meeting. On the agenda today, we have items of interest from commissioners, followed by the director's report, and then the consent agenda. On the consent agenda is consideration of the minutes from March 26th. That will be followed by the residential infill project PSC letter to council. That's a work session. That will then be followed by garbage and recycling rates briefing. And then we will have the Better Housing by Design work session. Items of interest. Mike, you leaning in or just getting ready? No? I wasn't sure whether you were like... Okay. Apparently no items of interest for Mike. Director's report, Joe?
Okay, a number of items. First, Psc Interviews. We're interviewing for the vacancies in the Planning and Sustainability Commission next week, or actually this week. We received 79 applications total. We went through a process to cull that down, and we're going to conduct 16 interviews this week to come up with a panel of 6 or 7 folks to forward to the mayor's office for the mayor's consideration. On that interview committee is myself and Nicoya Phillips from BPS. Eli is going to be on it, and Amy Rathfelder from the mayor's office. So those interviews will take place Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and June 11th is going to be the new commissioner's first meeting. Second, the PSC bylaws, Julie sent out an email on April 2nd about standardizing bylaws for city boards and commissions. And they're working through a few items that they'll forward the final to be approved by the mayor to the commission before it goes out, okay? Third, staff, in one of the recent meetings, PSC voted to forward to City Council amendments related to the inventory of the Willamette River for and with the idea that that was going to City Council on May 30th. We're going to delay that so it syncs up with when the South Reach goes, since it's really just a supporting document for the South Reach. So that won't be until early in 2020. I just wanted to correct your understanding of that. No changes to it. It's just syncing up the timing between the two. Finally, today is the last meeting for 2 of our commissioners, Teresa and Andre. I wanted to just give a few comments as in recognition of that, and just remind everybody that there's a reception on the 18th too, to sort of gather and honor those folks more thoroughly. But for Teresa, joined the commission in 2014. Dove into a number of our projects, but what's most notably to me was the whole life cycle of the residential infill project, from the advisory committee through the code project in the end. And in general, Teresa, I just wanted to acknowledge that throughout all these deliberations, you've always sort of brought a sense of calm in the storm to our meetings. Your input was thoughtful, often very kind, and staff really appreciated working with you, especially in that way. Secondly, Andre, this is Andre's last meeting as well. Andre, as of now, is currently our longest currently serving Planning and Sustainability Commission member. So it's almost been 10 years. It's over 10 years. Andre got on, not that he's counting, in 2004, I believe, as part of the Planning Commission, and the 16 years. I'm sorry, the 8, almost 10. Okay.
Well, you can't wait till we get this straight.
Yeah. So we're going
like another meeting is
we're going to commission a study. And we're looking for commissioner subcommittee to confirm these numbers before. Do we have any volunteers? Andre has been a real it's been a real that was a long period of service, and you were our chair for much of that. You were a great planning and sustainability commission chair, and the list of projects that you touched and moved through was long. But I think really notably is the work and the voice you've been for the advancement of equity in all of our projects. And you know, the capstone of that, or the sort of a major milestone of that, was the Portland Plan. And that was a really big deal. And actually, our work hasn't been different. It hasn't been the same since we went through that Portland Plan process. And your leadership was absolutely has marks all over that plan. And Howard, a former commissioner, was reflecting on serving on the commission with Andre, and thought about the Portland Plan as well, when he said that when we passed the Portland Plan, after many months of planning the future, and the whole commission voted aye, Howard glanced at Andre and caught a look of quiet satisfaction for a job well done. And
I think it was relief.
yeah. And according to Howard, that sums up, Andre, your service on the commission. It's very much a job well done. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for the director's report.
So I would like to say a few words. Is there anybody else who would like to pass on their appreciation to? And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if so, I'm going to let you go, and then I'll take the chair's prerogative and finish up. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, as the second longest serving member of the current commission, I've had the opportunity to work with Andre through the Portland Plan, the comp plan, and a lot of other things. And I just want to say that I appreciate the consistent leadership over all these years, and certainly helped open my eyes on a lot of issues, particularly equity-related issues, where my life experience didn't necessarily inform me of things I should be thinking about. So I appreciate helping me through expanding my vision. Thank you, Andre.
Any other comments? Then I'll roll here. So, Teresa, thank you so much for all of your time. Your passion for sustainability and your insight into our neighborhood communities, and all of the efforts on, as Joe said, on RIP, have been invaluable and helpful. Joe's absolutely right. You just bring have brought such a, I think, a collaborative, nice, calm work ethic to this group, and I have greatly appreciated it. Andre, I want to thank you for so much of your time, your leadership, and perhaps more towards just me personally, your mentorship. I echo Chris. The growth, my personal growth that you have helped evolve has been immense. You've taught me how to run meetings. Although Chris is still really kind of getting me through Robert's rules, more so than you, but you've given me great mentorship there, and more importantly, a broader and greater understanding of life experiences that I also don't have, especially with regards to social justice and inequality in our community. And you've done that with patience and grace, and so I'm grateful for all of that, and I'm grateful for everything that you've given to our entire community.
Thank you.
You're going to be sorely missed. Yes, you will. Okay, so thank you both. Do you want to jump in?
You want to say anything?
Don't feel like you have to.
Well, I just want to say what a pleasure and a privilege it's been to serve with all of you on the commission, and working with you for the city has been really an amazing experience. I have a little story to share, but I'm going to wait until after we finish with our RIP discussions because it fits a little bit better with that. So, Julie, you can hide that now if you'd like. Thank you.
After all these years.
He mentored me on turning on mics.
I want to thank you. I was appointed by Tom Potter, and if you don't know who Tom Potter is, that's how old I am. So, um, that is ways back. It was just the Planning Commission at that time, and there was a separate Sustainability Commission, and Sam Adams joined those. I want to thank staff, and it is not without notice. We do a lot of work that 2 years before staff has spent thousands of hours putting time in, and we do a few meetings and make a decision. Staff, Eric, Joe, I mean, you can go through amazing work. We question it sometimes, but I don't doubt it. And you got to keep that in mind. Just amazing. And I'm emotional because this has been part of my life for a long time. I would thank Howard, Karen, Dawn, Gary, Irma, and Michelle, previous members that were here. Howard coined the term special sauce. And if you look in the Portland plan, it is special sauce that makes this work. I hope we keep that going. I would like to thank each of you for your time and effort. I know it is a lot of work and a lot of time, and I would leave you with this, that enjoy yourself. This is at times frustrating. It is something that at times you don't know what to do, but if you enjoy yourself, you get through it and you actually do things. It's about people. Never forget that. We talk a lot about words and if this angle, but it's about people at the end of the day that you will affect their future and their today lives, and that is important. And Joe talked about equity, but equity is something that is more than a lens. It's actually people. And if you think about the people, a lot of this work gets very, not easy, but it gets easier in the decisions you make. And I would encourage each of you to live by your convictions. I have voted no, voted yes, encouraged others to go either way, but it's always been based on a conviction of what I thought was best for the city, which is, I think when you go around other cities, it's a pretty great city. We all have our problems, but at the end of the day, I think we're moving things forward, and the world is looking at us to see how we do it. And that's not it's not a mistake. It's an intention of this commission, of the decisions you make, that people look to us to say, well, Portland did it that way. How do I, as another city, do something similar? May not be the same, but we are setting and plowing a lot of original ground, and I hope you continue to do that. Thank you. It's truly been a pleasure. It has been a pleasure to work with you all. I've enjoyed it. I'm going to say I'm not going to miss it because been a lot of fun times and sometimes not as enjoyable, but at the end of the day, it really was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hard to move on from that. But next item on our agenda is the consent agenda. Consideration of the minutes from March 26th. Do I have a motion?
Move adoption.
Second? Second. So moved. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay, so on to residential infra project PSC letter to cancel. So this is a little bit of a break, but with the importance of this piece of this project along with as close as our vote was. And there was a lot of kind of back and forth as the letter was being drafted. We felt it was pretty important to make sure that we all kind of had a chance to talk about it together to make sure that it's hitting the points that are important, and kind of reflects the commission's vote correctly. So hopefully everybody's either got the copy or have had a chance to review it. And I guess I would just open it up for deliberation and expression of any, whether it's concerns or tweaks or recommendations. And if we finally just got it, maybe it's a quick conversation. Go for it.
So I like the letter. I think the question I have is, do these letters contain, like, there's a couple big moves in this project that decreasing how large homes can be and changing the way we define height, increasing the number of units that are available, introducing a visitability requirement that's never been in the code before. Do those things get mentioned in these letters? If so, they could be tossed in. If not, leave that to the 8-pager that goes along with it.
They can be. When we were looking at the Central City 2035 letter, it was a long list of that. So we'd be glad to go back and add a few sentences if you want. It's also so yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Chris.
This is a relatively minor concern, but I want to see if it resonates for other commissioners. So when talking about the displacement risk, we talk about the overall reduction, which I think is important, and then we say, however, the risk is increased in 3 areas, which could see more infill under the new code. I'm a little bit concerned about the precision of saying 3 areas, because we know that this is only a forecast, and depending on whether you think about the 4,000 forecast or the 20,000 forecast, it could be more. So I might say something more like a small number of areas, or making the claim that it's only 3 strikes me as being having precision at the expense of accuracy. So just a thought.
I would support that. Okay.
The only thing I would say is the 3 areas defines that there's a problem, and so however you wordsmith that it still defines that there's areas of Portland that are still at risk.
Right.
It's not. I don't want to diminish the language.
Right. And by not saying 3, I want to make sure we're not underselling that risk, because my fear is it could be more. Right.
Okay. Understood.
Any other comments?
Having just read this, so these are sort of top of the head. I have 2 different ones. One, we say twice that RIP is going to create a disincentive for demolitions, and we say it a second time. And I'm not sure why or how we're reaching that conclusion. I'm not sure what testimony or evidence we were given that said that. I think there was some uncertainty about what its impacts would be on demolition, and that somewhere along the way we sort of said, well, focusing on demolition really isn't a primary or even a secondary focus of RIP. We're doing RIP in the hopes that overall it's a good thing. We're going to get more housing. We're going to get smaller houses. They're going to be more affordable. Those are all good things, and I'm not sure, particularly since we say it twice, that there's sort of an analysis that backs that up.
I thought the financial analysis backed that up.
Jerry Johnson said the opposite. So I just wonder if this is
enough. So. I think Jerry Johnson backed up the reduction of demolitions in the revised financial analysis as it reflected our revisions. Joe?
I believe that's accurate. The reduction in the size of houses compared to what they could be originally had a dramatic impact. In the second run, also had an impact in that way. So,
go ahead, Teresa.
Okay.
Right. But I think what Jeff's pointing out is there's a balance because we've increased ability to build certain types of homes in other spots, fourplexes or 4-unit or whatever we call them. So that could balance the single residential homes by allowing demolitions for properties that are big that could fit more things on them. So I think there's two. I think in the size of the home building, that's an accurate statement. But I think there's also a corollary piece that that comes up in terms of what promotes incentive for demolition.
Yes, yes. But I think, and I'll confirm with staff if we need to, that even when we did do the increase the FAR by the number of units, the economics of it works. That it still moderates the choice to demolish. It's less than without that. Correct?
So yeah, so the second Johnson economic analysis showed a moderate increase in demolitions compared to the baseline, but again, that's comparing the high growth scenario, the 24,000 additional units, which is different than what we're projecting for additional households over the 20-year planning period, right? So it's in combination, the reduced FAR reduces the profit margin for demolishing houses and replacing them, so there's a demolition disincentive there, as well as when we're producing more housing units, when demolition occurs, that's reducing the pressure to demolish other houses elsewhere. So rather than 16,000 new homes being built at a relative rate of 1.5 to 1 demolitions, we're looking at potentially 20,000 units being produced at a rate of about 3 to 1 on the demolition scale.
So as a compromise, would it be, how about we remove at least, so there's not two references, maybe don't overemphasize it?
I just want to be sure we're not overselling something because we know there's an audience that wants to believe that. And I just want to be, if staff is comfortable, the data is there. I think anecdotally, I'm nervous that that's going to prove correct. And so I'm just raising concern, and I'll defer to staff's confidence in the analysis they have, but I just want to be sure we're not, my point is, I fear we're overselling something that the analysis isn't that clear on. But again, I'll raise the concern. I've raised it. If staff is confident and comfortable, then getting rid of one, saying it twice instead of once might be fine. I don't have a strong position on that.
Okay.
Is there anybody else who wants to?
And the other thing I just want to point out, as sort of as a informal planning commission matter, and I realize this was a tough vote. We ended up 5-4. Would have been 6-4 if I could have been there. And I recently had this conversation with the chair about what level of engagement should the minority position have when the commission sends a recommendation letter to the council. We try to make it a short letter that conveys our thinking, supports our position, and sort of encourages the council to follow our majority recommendation. What we've done in this letter is we've really given a lot of balance to the minority position. I mean, we've sort of made displacement sort of almost a critical factor in the council's consideration. I mean, we've talked about the benefits of RIP, but we've also, and I don't mean any disrespect to the minority, it was still the minority position. I would have no problem with a second letter. But I'm just concerned, and again, I'm raising concern, and just to think about future situations where this arises. I think we've diluted a little bit the message that the majority thinks RIP is a good thing. It's not a perfect thing, but on balance, we think it's going to achieve a lot of important city goals, and I think we've diluted that message a little bit by a lot of discussion about displacement, and I think it diminishes a little bit of the attention to what we all thought was going to be a pretty bold and progressive and effective new zoning code / policy change. But I understand there's a lot of passion on displacement, and so I would prefer to see separate approaches. A brief reference to it in the main letter, and say for more detailed, see the supporting or the accompanying minority letter. But just a thought, just my perspective on it.
So I think if you and I have discussed, we don't do accompanying minority letters. So for what it's worth, as somebody who also voted yes, I voted yes, but I did have concern about displacement. And I think that's what the letter's trying to strike that balance is. There was a lot of, I think, first of all, we had a lot of healthy deliberations about how to frame or approach displacement. Some heated discussions about whether some who were maybe more positive towards RIP moving forward than others, about whether we were keeping displacement in mind. And I guess what I would say is, I think I would be surprised if there wasn't one person sitting at this table, no matter how you voted, that wasn't keeping that as a part of their framework for making a decision. And I think that's what the letter is trying to say, that some people were very concerned about it, but came down on the side of yes. Some people were very concerned about it and came down on the side of no. So that's my thought on it.
I would just say the letter is our conveyance to council of what we thought about whatever the policy is. And in terms of my experience is that council wants to know, obviously, yes, what did you vote on and what were the germane issues that you encountered. They also, in my experience, want to know, especially when there's close votes, why the close vote? Because there's something there. People just didn't, if it's 1-9, well, okay, that may be one issue, but very close votes, there's something there that they need to be aware of. And the conveyance of what that particular issue is or issues is important for council as they go into their deliberations. It gives them an opportunity to ask more questions about that and get comfortable from staff that now is talking to them about conveying our message. And the two letters, I don't remember us ever sending two letters, but we've always conveyed concerns of the minority to the extent that it was relevant. I mean, the closer the vote, probably the bigger the portion dedicated to the minority, just because council needs to know that there's some major concerns or there's not. And I would say you're better off telling council there's a concern in a joint letter than a separate letter, because now it looks like we're not a unit, we're two fractions of a commission.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that the strength of our voice as a commission is much stronger if we have, after a very close vote, we have something consensus or much closer consensus letter to follow up, which you can achieve with one letter. So I like this approach. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of worry of, as you're pointing out, that the letter is if it's mostly focused on displacement, it could lose the focus on why this project happened in the first place. So I remember when Teresa and I were at those first meetings at RIPSAC, and staff said, we're doing this code update to deal with huge public concern about how large homes are, lack of housing choice, and these narrow lots, that there's 3 different flavors of them. What do we do with that? So if it's the feeling that if reading this letter cold, you don't catch any of that, like why did we do this project in the first place, then maybe we do need to have a little bit more of that put in here, because displacement wasn't the original motivation for the RIP project. I mean, I've heard of many reasons given why that project was germinated, but displacement wasn't one of them. But we learned it along the way, and it became a big enough issue that it made it a close vote going to city council. So I'm totally supportive of including that in here. But if we feel like it's helpful to bolster the original reasons that got city council to assign this bureau to do this code update, and we heard thousands of people testify, if the original motivation for doing this project isn't conveyed in the letter, then I'd be supportive of bolstering that. And there was one language at the end of it about the disadvantages of single-family zoning that didn't make the cut for this. And I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that needs to be brought back in, but that's one motivation we heard for the project. I think it may be cleaner if we're going to add something in to go back to what happened in the first meeting of RIPSAC when we had those three drivers that no one was going to be totally satisfied, but we heard those voices loud and clear at the beginning, and maybe a way to premise this is why we did this project and make sure that's articulated well enough in the letter.
I support bolstering it, and I perhaps lean more towards your first comment about the things that this is accomplishing and trying to make some emphasis there. My only concern about starting from the very beginning of the project is there were goals that started there, and then there were also goals that we as a commission put down, and they don't necessarily prioritize in the same way. And so we may have and so I guess I'm kind of not sure how to go about explaining that. That's the only thing going through my head with starting with that. But I think we could certainly strengthen the positives of the project in this letter, in the ways that you talked about kind of enumerating the things that it's accomplishing and making that more obvious. Any other? Yes, Katie.
Well, I'm sorry that I didn't get here earlier, but I did want to say that I don't know, I like the letter a lot because there's a concept called groupthink where everybody thinks the same and they would all vote together at the same time at this, it would all be aye or it'd all be nay. And this commission has just gone through a vote where we went basically half and half, just a little nudge over towards yes, and yet it ended with a lot of respect and a lot of really good discussion. I am really pleased and proud, and the letter, I love the fact that I could, weigh in on the letter earlier and get some of my comments in. I think that's, I just think it's a really wonderful way for us to all work together. Thank you.
So I think maybe is there support for adding perhaps a little more detail about what the project accomplishes from the commission? It seems like everybody's there, so unless there's other, you got other.
To the one part that was eliminated at the very end there, Eli, I just have a problem with that in terms of saying zoning. This eliminates that zoning. That is problematic. But I really, if you want to bolster this letter and say it was more, this is what it was there to accomplish. It's not my letter, but I support that because in part I do agree with that it is about, this letter is a little bit about displacement, but I do think on balance, council needs to know that arrow is coming their way, and they better buckle up. So, but they also need to know why we took this on in the first place.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Go ahead.
Okay. So, Julie, can you go back to the first picture? Yeah. What? Okay. So I was.
Oh, you missed that.
I was thinking about.
It's an explosive issue.
It is. I was thinking about RIP, and I was trying to, come up with other things to put in the letter and just sort of finishing off. So I'm at Haleakala, which is on Maui. It looks like that. Okay, next one. But what it brought to me was a little grain of information that I think I'm going to leave you with that I hope will be helpful in the future. And it's about statistics. So if you look at that, this comes from the National Park brochure. Haleakala, you saw what it looks like. It looks like a crater. It doesn't look like a mountain. I mean, a mountainous crater, okay? So if you measure it from sea level, it's, like under the ocean. It's an island. You can do that. It's 28,000 feet, and they're saying it's the third largest mountain on Earth. But if you look at it from where most people look at it, which is, standing on the ground, it's 10,000 feet. And the point is that with our statistics, they're complicated. We're making complicated decisions that take complicated numbers that you're really relying on to help give you information based on large craters or explosive environments or whatever you want to say. And so the point of this for me was to remember where you're starting from and what you're measuring, because objectively, I guess both of those statements are true. I did do a little fact checking, but you can go to the next slide, Julie. Calling it the third largest mountain on Earth, but then go to the next one. Bracing that by saying it's from the sea floor. Okay, you know, it's a perspective, right? So thinking about what our statistics, what our baselines are, what we're actually really trying to measure. You can get statistics that can support a variety of different perspectives. And that was all I wanted to do, is just think of Haleakala when you're thinking about really complicated statistics, and go back to the basics, is what are we measuring from?
Thank you. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I have a question about letter number 2, which may become as many as 5 pages. What, are we going to see that letter?
I would hope so. I mean,
Okay.
that would be my intent. Yes.
All right.
I don't think staff's quite drafted it. I'm getting no's.
Okay.
So yeah. Okay. And they're promised me we're going to see it. Yes. And I'm quite open to also having, you know, as we do some back and forth via email with staff, and then bringing it back for deliberations and work session, just like we did this. Great. Okay. Next item on the agenda, unless I don't see any other people leaning in to speak.
Make one request on that. Can we do that relatively soon while we're still fresh on it? Because we're gonna, our memories will fade about the details on this project. Maybe they already are.
And I'm getting a thumbs up. Thumbs up. Okay. Next item on our agenda. Oh, and by the way, for those who don't know why we have extra special sweets, they were in thanks to your time. So thank you for allowing us to have nice dessert today. Next item on the agenda is garbage and recycling rates. This is a briefing. Welcome.
Hello.
Commissioner Schultz, members of the commission.
I think your mic is not on, and we want to hear everything.
Commissioner Schultz, members of the commission. I'm Bruce Walker, the Solid Waste and Recycling Manager for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And with me is Ariane Sperry. We're here to talk about Haleakala, and we'd much rather be talking about that. It's a wonderful place. But we're here today to discuss the annual rate-making process for residential curbside garbage, recycling, and composting collection. As a reminder, curbside collection includes single-family homes and duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. Properties with 5 or more units and businesses are part of our commercial sector, which has a different system, and the City of Portland does not set rates for those services. We have a lot of rules for those services, but no rates. Last year, you will recall that we were on an expedited schedule to address the unprecedented changes in global recycling markets that increased costs to our system. This year, we're back on our typical schedule. Today, Ariane will lay out the rate review process and provide you with an initial look at the key rate drivers. After we complete our analysis, we will present proposed rates at a hearing on April 30th and ask you to vote on whether to recommend the rates to City Council. The rates will be considered by the City Council at the utility rate hearing on May 15th. Then the adopted rates for next fiscal year will take effect on July 1st. Ariane will now walk you through the rate review process and key rate inputs.
Thanks, Bruce. So, as they do every year, our 11 franchisees have all submitted their detailed cost reports, or DCRs, that contain their revenues and costs for the previous calendar year, 2018. And our contracted CPA firm is currently reviewing those DCRs for the haulers that were selected for our sample this year. And this year, our sample includes 5 haulers that represent almost 90% of the customer base. And we originally started doing this sampling process because when we started the franchise in 1992, we had 69 franchised haulers, so we couldn't review all of their detailed cost reports. Once the CPA firm ensures that all costs are allowed and documents that everything's in order, the sample hauler's costs will be averaged to develop a per customer composite cost. And our rates are designed to allow haulers the opportunity to recover the per customer composite cost to provide service, plus a 9.5% operating margin and a 5% franchise fee paid to BPS. We offer a range of service levels, and that is shown on the little chart there. By far the most common is the 35-gallon roll cart collected every week. But over the past 8 years, since we moved to every other week garbage collection, we've seen a steady trend of customers moving into the 60-gallon roll cart, which is now the second most popular service level. And we see that as a good thing, that folks are right-sizing the service level for their household. And we want to make sure that they have room for all their garbage in their garbage cart, rather than maybe doing some wishful recycling that contributes to contamination and makes it more expensive for us to process and market our recycling material, especially now that standards for recycling are higher and the material has to be a lot cleaner. So after we have developed last year's average cost, we make adjustments for inflation moving forward. And the inflation is not added to the current rates. It's applied to the actual costs for providing service from the previous year. And this way, reduced operating costs can mitigate the effect of inflationary pressure. And since we're making rates for the 2019-2020 fiscal year, the inflation forecast is for the 18-month period from January of 2019 through June of 2020. And that's anticipated to be around 3.5%. We also adjust labor costs, and we take into account union contracts and general cost of living, and it's in a similar range, around between 3.5% to 4%. You may recall that BPS implemented a clean fleet program that required haulers to phase out older trucks and buy new trucks that meet higher emission standards, and our rates increased in order to cover the costs of those cleaner vehicles. The depreciation schedule for hauler trucks is 5 years for recycling vehicles and 7 years for trucks that haul garbage and composting. And so this year, we're starting to see a significant drop in vehicle costs as those hauler investments are finally starting to cycle out of the rates. And so that's one rate component pushing rates down this year. In terms of cost for garbage disposal, that's another good news. It's a factor of both the amount of garbage disposed and the price that haulers pay to tip their garbage at Metro transfer stations. And this year, Metro's tip fee for garbage is staying the same, so that's good. And the amount of garbage, we check that in 2 ways. First, the haulers report to us how much they collect, and we also do a weight study where we have community environmental services at Portland State go out several times a year and weigh garbage containers of various sizes, and that's how we allocate the amount, the different amount of that the different size carts weigh, and so we can price them appropriately. And it also provides a double check on the amount of garbage collected. And so while we don't anticipate an increase in the cost for garbage disposal, Metro is increasing the tip fee for yard debris and food scraps at their facilities pretty significantly, almost $11 a ton. And so that will be a big change, resulting in upward rate pressure this year. In terms of recycling markets, as Bruce mentioned last year, we had to expedite our rate review to account for the worldwide drop in recycled materials prices and increased processing costs at recycling sorting facilities. And City Council adopted a pretty hefty rate increase of $2.55, and almost all of that went to truing up costs for managing recycled materials. The good news is that recycled market conditions have not worsened since last spring, and we don't anticipate additional upward pressure on rates from this particular rate component. And this year, we're also eyeing a new issue. Last November, Portland voters approved the Portland Clean Energy Initiative, which will add a 1% revenue surcharge on retail corporations that have both over $1 billion in national sales and over $500,000 in local sales. And those funds will be directed to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and green infrastructure projects. And so we do have a few franchised haulers that we believe would meet those revenue thresholds and be subject to the surcharge. The initiative included an exemption for utilities, but it's unclear whether curbside residential waste collection will be included within the definition of utility. And so the Revenue Bureau and City Attorney are considering that issue and will be making a determination soon. And should the surcharge apply, it would increase rates for all customers by approximately 20 cents a month.
Question about that? Since you know which haulers are potentially affected, do you know what percentage of households are served by haulers that would be impacted by that?
About half.
About half. Thank you.
But we would just spread it out over everybody.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the main components affecting the calculation of cost of service rates this year. And then once cost of service rates are determined, BPS applies discounts to smaller size garbage containers to incentivize customers to reduce waste and recycle and compost more, and adds disincentive premiums to the larger garbage service levels. And this year, we're going to be taking a closer look at the disincentive premium on the 60-gallon roll cart. As I mentioned earlier, we really want folks to right-size their garbage container to meet their household's needs. So those are the primary issues this year, and we're happy to answer any questions. And we'll be back with proposed rates at a hearing on April 30th, seeking your recommendation to City Council.
Thank you. So Teresa got my attention first.
So I have a question. When you did the analysis on the different haulers' rates the CPA firm did, was there very much variance between low and high in terms of, was that spread big?
It typically is. There are companies that are more efficient, and that can change over time as their costs change. They make investments.
Okay, on the order of 25%, 50%, or like 3%? I don't know what you think is a lot in variance.
The range would be, the target is 9.5%. So we see some that are 3 or 4% above that, and then likewise there are some that are operating 3 or 4 percentage points below that, and it varies. It's not the same haulers each year. It
Sure.
varies
That's a
depending on their
relatively
expenses.
small range for this kind of operation. I just wondered because if there's like, okay, you are the guy, you got to say that the costs are like $1 billion. We'll all do these, and then we'll average it out. We'll get $500 million. That's why I was asking the question. But it sounds like it's all within a range. Thank you.
Chris, we'll just come around. How about that?
Okay. So I have to ask the question I ask every year, which is, this year I'll phrase it as, how is the vehicle side guard pilot going, and are there any next steps with that?
Do you want to answer that?
So Commissioner Smith is bringing up the side guards for solid waste vehicles. It's part of the Portland Bureau of Transportation Vision Zero policy. Many other cities have adopted this. The side guards are installed between the front and rear axles to prevent collision with whether it's cyclists or pedestrians from getting dragged under the vehicle and be put in a very compromised, dangerous position. So that's my quick recap of that. So we, BPS, took on with the Portland haulers a pilot program that we have installed on 18 vehicles, the side guards, both residential and commercial vehicles, to test them in all applications. We are readying a recommendation to come back and take some next steps. We're trying to finalize that right now, but in general, the side guards worked well on the roads, which is good news. And the other important factor that I'd like to bring up is that the Portland Bureau of Transportation is taking a pretty significant step in making side guards as part of the fleet of maintenance vehicles that serves Portland streets.
Thank you for being the early adopter.
Hi. My question is around the Metro increase tip fee for yard debris and food scraps. Since that's such a big jump, how do you expect that to affect prices for customers around the city?
Yeah. Our initial analysis is that it could bump up rates 30 or 40 cents per customer per month.
Thank you, Daisy, for asking the first part of my question.
May I ask just a little add-on? Our bureau sought to reduce that and made apparently not effective testimony, that was me, at their council to try to spread that out over a couple years. So we're trying to mitigate these costs. Metro feels that it's important that they adjust their costs, and our ratepayers are going to, it's going to factor into our rate review this year.
Ben, can I quickly jump in because I don't understand something?
Okay.
So sorry for not getting this, but if there's increased competition, why are they requiring
you ask
more
very
money?
Good questions. Yeah,
we don't know.
Well, they have to cover their costs of moving the material through their facilities, and so they have a certain level of costs and less material. So per ton, they're increasing their rates.
Do we have the option of going to other facilities?
And a lot of our haulers are moving their material to a few other facilities, and that's why Metro is seeing a drop in the tonnage that is coming through their facilities.
Okay, go ahead, Ben. I'll poke at this bear a little bit later.
Well, I guess great minds think alike. You guys stole my questions, so I have basically the same question: is if there is increased competition, why is the cost going up so substantially? So maybe we can't give an answer now, but that's something we want to probably think about a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's something we've talked to Metro staff about, and that's just their approach that they're taking is to recover their costs, and what that will end up doing down the line, it's not something that we've gotten good answers from them on.
I just have a couple of questions on the Portland Clean Energy surcharge. Can that money stay in the garbage rate area to help the garbage haulers in some manner? I mean, if we're forced to collect it, can we keep it and doing projects around, with the intent of the voter approval, renewable energy efficiency? So from their facilities, that would save us money. Can we make investments? Maybe we can make investments over at Metro to cause them to save some money. I don't know, but but somehow keep it in the system versus it goes somewhere else, that we can make investments to create some energy efficiency somehow from that that standpoint. The other one is I probably don't need it today, and I won't be here for the. But can you give the commission an update on the minority garbage hauler initiative when you come back?
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, great, thanks. And on the Metro thing, is it possible we could get a letter from them explaining the rate increase? Because it seems like a diminishing return, if I understand it. People are going away from their facility, so our rates are going to go up. Can we move away from, I mean, if it's a diminishing return and pretty soon we're the only ones left supporting them, can we go somewhere else before we're the last ones holding the bag?
Yeah, I guess, and that's kind of where I was like going to go out with me poking the bear. I guess I'd like information on, do we have the option to not use Metro and go to other haulers? And if so, what are they charging? And if so, can we not just require the haulers to go elsewhere instead of Metro? And you can come back with that if you need to.
So our haulers have the ability to go to different facilities right now. And there is some cost savings associated with that in the tip fee charged at those facilities. But other factors play into this in terms of the route efficiency. If a hauler has to drive further to unload and then get back to their route, it may be counterproductive to go to other facilities. So all this is factored in when haulers look at where to dispose of their materials. But we're not just automatically increasing the rate, the highest rate possible, but we also analyze what the charges are at other facilities and where the preponderance of material goes. And back to Andre's point, and it seems likely that more of the material will flow away from Metro facilities if their rates are out of line or too high. So, but that's something that they've chosen to deal with this year, and a rate increase that we tried to dampen.
So, but can we not, when you come back, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm inclined to say, okay, you get, I don't know, 50 per ton, not 70 in this increase, and which is going to encourage the haulers to perhaps not use Metro. And yeah, I get it. I'm just kind of curious, I guess, about really understanding if you're going to kind of push back on that, and instead of just doing the easy thing, which would be, my assumption is, I'm used to going to Metro. It's on my route. Yeah, it's going to save me a mile or two. And as long as I get the ratepayers to pay this $77.91 a ton, oh well. Versus, no, we're not going to give it to you. So sorry, you're going to go out of your way a little bit more. But granted, if you're going out of your way a little bit more and it's causing a lot more extra costs, I get it. Or putting a lot more carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. I mean, I think it'd be helpful to understand that trade-off.
As a sidelight, do we have the ability to go to, let's say, not Metro, but other hauler places where this material is received and just negotiate a Portland rate? Because it seems that we have a lot of material and go and negotiate it and see if we could get a lower rate. And even if they have to, the hauler has to haul a little more and stuff. If there's enough savings there, maybe it makes sense for us to go away from Metro. And maybe then Metro would get the clue that.
Eli?
Way back in the day, my memory may not be accurate on this, but does some of Metro's tipping fee go to fund local government? I thought that the Office of Sustainability got some funding from Metro's tipping fee at some point in the past. Whether it's still the case now, I don't know. I'm just wondering, from Metro's perspective, whether when haulers are taking their waste elsewhere, are those haulers dodging those fees? Because wherever else they're not paying that fee. So I guess I'm helping to understanding that a little bit might, if what's going on here is that haulers are Metro decided as a region to collect some fees on tipping to help encourage people to be more to not throw as much trash out, and use some of that funding to fund waste reduction programs in the region. If what's happening is that our haulers are finding out that they can actually drive a little further and just dodge that whole fee, then there's something broken in that system. It should be more of a level playing field.
So that's not a direct link as you've proposed it. The fees that are charged at disposal site facilities throughout the region is added on. It's called a regional system fee. So and that fee includes additional funding for Metro waste reduction programs, and that's provided to local governments like ourselves. So we receive substantial funding from Metro in the tune of $800,000 per year. We work with Metro in a very cooperative and I think successful manner. They're really good partners on a whole range of issues. So on this, though, specifically to your point, that regional system fee is distributed on solid waste tons, not on the residential organics, not on recycling. So that scenario you played out would not take place here. So what it does do, though, is in your example, is if a hauler went to a private transfer station, that the regional system fee would apply and be collected by Metro, and a portion of it distributed to our program and other local governments throughout the region. Does that make sense?
I think so. So if I were a hauler in this category and I took my stuff, the trash stuff, out to Hillsborough or some other transfer station, the trash element of it, they'd still be paying into the joint.
Correct.
You wouldn't be dodging that tax by going to some other area.
Correct.
Okay. That helps me understand it. But for yard waste and garbage, that's where we're not collecting. When people tip, when haulers dispose of yard waste, they're not paying into that fund for that piece of it?
That's correct.
Gotcha. Here or anywhere else?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'll leave your complicated relationship with Metro and the negotiations to everyone's asked you enough questions there. So I'm sure every time you pull, there's a push with Metro. But just one quick question, and Joe, this may be you. Does BPS have any control over how the clean energy funds are going to be spent? Who's designing those expenditure programs?
The role of the Bureau in the Clean Energy Fund is as sort of a fiscal agent and to house the kickoff of the organization. The resolution that created Clean Energy Funds, the referendum, has in there instructions or descriptions of the steering committee that will be created, and so that process and hosting that to be created is a responsibility that we'll have over the next year. That group will be the one to shape the spending policies and priorities of the fund, which isn't necessarily the Bureau. It's a community-driven sort of fund with city fiscal responsibility and oversight.
So I assume there's going to be lots of competing entities trying to get some of that money. Is there some city... I assume a citizens committee can't make the final decisions that they must be making. Is the committee making recommendations to council? I'm just trying to figure out how much of a oversight role the Bureau is playing in it.
Oh, it's, Jeff, I need to go double check on sort of the specifics of the decision-making protocol when they finally get up and running. I'm not 100% sure of that. The Bureau will not have an oversight role.
So the suggestion Andre made about trying to keep that money within the solid waste system is not something you'd have any ability to advocate for? Or?
We'd be able to advocate for it to the committee, the steering committee of the fund.
But as would any other bureau, I mean, we don't have any kind of particular, because we have solid waste, that doesn't give us any
I don't
leg
believe
up
it
on
does.
that.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Try it.
Go ahead,
No,
Mike.
I thought your idea made sense.
Well, just to add to the confusion, perhaps, I vaguely recall testifying before Metro Council to increase their tippage fees because some of that money goes into neighborhood grant programs, quality of life grant programs, and cleaning up a lot of the garbage that winds up out there in natural areas and so forth. So there is some of that money goes to those programs, and I do remember
So
testifying.
you're responsible. We'll send the letters to Mike.
But just to clarify, you guys are talking about yard waste, and like the fee that's going up isn't throwing the trash out. That's uniform across the region. It's the I probably, as people throw trash out, and now that there is a whole separate system for yard debris and food scraps, that's the part where we're getting higher costs. Not tax that, and increasing the cost for that. I don't know if we want to do that.
Okay. So I think with that, we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you back here. And what's the date again?
April 30th.
April 30th. And I'm sure we'll get to talk a lot more about Metro then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is a Better Housing by Design work session. Welcome back.
Take it away, Bill. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
It's been a few months. I think we had our last work session with you in December, so a good 4 months since you've talked about Better Housing by Design. But it's back now with completed documents. So I think you all should have received the 3 main volumes of the revised proposed draft, and you're also provided links to several appendices that are part of it, as well as comp plan and zoning maps that are part of the total package. Wanted to highlight what we're going to review today. In some ways, today's session is a continuation of our work session discussions on refinements to the earlier proposed draft. And what we intend to cover today are, one, what ended up in the revised proposed draft, what are some of the changes from the earlier proposed draft, and just the intention is to provide an overview of that. We'll also be providing a review of the displacement risk analysis that we actually generated a report back in May and talked to you a while back about it. But given the discussions you've had with RIP, we thought it was a good idea to revisit some of what we had learned from that displacement risk analysis. And then I wanted to go over 3 additional potential amendments that staff is suggesting. And some of these are following up on direction we received from PSC in earlier work sessions. The items include coming back with some information on the Eastern Portland minimum site frontage requirement, some potential approaches for historic district zoning, and then a new potential item related to FAR transfer allowances that are linked to seismic upgrades. With that, and unless there's a basic question about the overview, I was going to launch into this agenda. All right, moving into things, just to put you back in the mood for multi-dwelling zoning. This map is showing the multi-dwelling zoning. It's only 8% of the city's land area, so it's not a whole lot of zoning, but it's typically located close to our corridors, close to our centers, places where our policies call for focusing housing opportunity. I'm not going to ask you to look at this table, but did want to highlight that the memo we provided had a complete listing of the substantive additions to the earlier proposed draft that are now part of the revised proposed draft. And I'm going to provide a brief overview of the elements that are now in the revised proposed draft. These aren't really action items, just wanted to give you a heads up as to what's in there. And we will be giving you an opportunity over the next week to identify any additional changes or revisions you would like to see. But on April 30th, when we come back to you with what we hope to be a closer to finalized package, these are all part of the revised proposed draft. And unless people have issues, you would be voting on this as part of the package of the revised proposed draft elements. The thing to highlight is most of the major proposals that are a part of the Better Housing by Design project are still in the revised proposed draft, and that includes things like regulating by a building scale instead of a unit density, our expanded affordable housing provisions, including increases in the amount of inclusionary housing bonus, a new deeper affordability bonus, new moderate income family housing bonus, new FAR transfer allowances that are intended to encourage preservation of existing affordable housing, as well as large trees and historic resources, and the provisions to allow small-scale commercial uses in major corridors are there. As you're aware, just to remind you, since this is so central, we have a new spectrum of zones, all regulated by scale with flexibility for how many units are in that scale, with a base FAR and a bonus FAR. The changes that are now in the revised proposed draft, and these came from the past 6 work sessions you had with us, and we were able to include all the requested changes that PSC had directed us to undertake. And amongst the changes were to allow all the FAR bonus and transfer allowances in historic districts, both in the multi-dwelling and mixed-use zones. Earlier, there had been some exclusion of the use of those bonuses and transfers in historic districts. We switched the visitable unit standards to being a voluntary bonus instead of a mandatory requirement. Also, there's a little change to the way minimum density would be calculated, reducing a minimum a bit when you're preserving in a residential structure. So those all came out of straw votes you had during your work sessions. I wanted to flag one item. We're trying to take a look at which items had pretty close straw votes, and one that did appear to have a pretty close vote, about a 5-4 vote, was the decision to allow FAR bonus and transfer allowances in the historic and conservation districts. And the orange boxes are showing some of the provisions that we had originally proposed not to allow in historic districts. And these include FAR transfers from other sites, which are allowed when you're preserving certain key attributes, as well as our deeper housing affordability bonus, which doubled the amount of FAR or scale when projects provide at least half the units affordable at 60% median family income. So these are now allowed in historic districts. Just wanted to be clear that it was something that was close and wanted to bring it to your attention. We are going to have another item that does return to the historic district topic a little bit later. Any questions about this one? Okay, moving on. Outdoor spaces and green elements. I'm not going to rattle through everything that was in the original proposal. Basically, the proposals were trying to promote and encourage outdoor spaces and green elements and de-emphasize parking as what we require. And some of the changes were really related to the details of these site design and green elements aspects. One was PSC had asked us to vary the width of required pedestrian connections based on numbers of units. There was a change to the small site threshold, which related to minimum parking requirements and some landscaping. We bumped it up to 10,000 square feet instead of the earlier 7,500 square foot proposal. And that applies both in mixed use and multi-dwelling zones. We'd be allowing small accessory structures and required setbacks regardless of site size or housing type. And to be consistent with the multi-dwelling code proposals, we would be changing the mixed-use zones for large sites beyond a frequent transit buffer, changing the minimum parking requirement from 1 space for every unit to now being 1 space for every 2 units. And that brings consistency across the 2 types of zones. And unless there are questions about that, I'm going to move on as well. All these items, again, a key thing to be aware of is you could either flag some items now or raise them between now and next Tuesday for our attention. Building design and scale, a range of issues related to trying to improve the street frontage of development, de-emphasizing garages, trying to knit higher density development through design approaches into the fabric of neighborhoods. Amongst the changes to these, and some of these are really related about building scale, one of the PSC pieces of direction was there is a current allowance for 100-foot building height in the RM4 zone close to light rail stations. And PSC provided us direction to allow that building height within 500 feet of frequent transit bus lines, although limiting that aspect of it to being only outside historic districts. And the direction was to keep the 100-foot height allowance close to light rail stations, including, in this case, in historic districts. There are also changes to the step-down height requirements. Instead of a 35-foot step down across a street from single-family zones, it was changed to a 45-foot height, the idea that the street provides a bit of a transition. Also, direction provided to not require step downs between the higher density CM3 mixed-use zone and the RM2 zone, with the idea being that both are intended to be fairly urban type zones. The CM3 allows 65 feet of height, RM2 45 feet, no need to step down. A more significant change, and I wanted to just touch a bit more on this one, was on major corridors, especially corridors where you have a mix of kind of commercial zoning and multi-dwelling zoning. The direction was to provide allowances for no setbacks between properties along those major corridors. And the intention was, since these corridors are typically pretty key transit streets, places we want to cultivate as thriving urban environments, we would change the existing requirements for setbacks on those key places. And it would apply to the somewhat higher density multi-dwelling zones, RM2 through RM4. Staff we were directed to determine where this approach would apply. The general pieces of direction we had was see how we could apply it in places that have that mix of multi-dwelling and commercial. Can we apply it to maybe centers or some other approach? And what we took a look at were a range of options and landed on the idea of requiring it, sorry about the scale here, on our civic and neighborhood corridors located in the inner pattern area. Inner pattern area is this gray area. And the civic and neighborhood corridors include major streets like Martin Luther King Boulevard, as well as streets like Lombard and Southeast Division. This is a bit of a close-up showing areas where this would apply. And the blue is showing the multi-dwelling zones, and I think the pinkish color are the mixed-use zones. We did look at an option where you would only provide that provision if you happen to be on a corridor block frontage that had mixed-use zoning, but it ended up with pretty tricky regulatory approaches. What we found is the area of the city where you typically have that mix of multi-dwelling and mixed-use zoning are the older inner neighborhoods where you have that established pattern of main streets with the shoulder-to-shoulder buildings. So the proposal we landed on, which would provide some simplicity in implementation, is just having it civic and neighborhood corridors in the inner pattern area, not the smallest scale RM1 zone, but the higher density multi-dwelling zones.
Are the dark black lines the streets on which it would apply?
Yes. Yeah, the heavy black lines are the civic and neighborhood corridors, so it would not apply to any of the other streets. Any questions about this one?
Yes, at some point, if you go back a slide, now that I know which corridors apply, I wonder if I can see it on this one a little bit. Okay, so this one, the darker black streets are the ones where the no setbacks would apply.
Right, and I think in past conversations, we acknowledge the fact that there's some streets like Killingsworth that have lengthy stretches of multi-dwelling zoning that aren't near mixed use, but that zoning is actually the smaller scale RM1 zone. And that fit well with the idea that it would not apply to the small scale zone that's intended to have more continuity with single family characteristics, but only the more intensely corridor type multifamily zoning.
Okay, so there would be a civic neighborhood corridor, but the RM1 zoning wouldn't apply.
Right.
I got it. Thanks.
Any other questions about this one? Okay, I'll move on. A few other changes, pretty minor to building design and scale, some changes to the ground floor window coverage requirements. We changed some of the front garage and structured parking limitations to be consistent with the residential infill proposals. We had also we received direction to regulate front parking differently for large sites, provide a bit more flexibility compared to small sites. There are also some proposals specific to East Portland that remain part of the proposal, including requirements for deeper setbacks in East Portland, but also the option of trading that off for centralized courtyards as an alternative. There's also a requirement for minimum street frontage requirements in East Portland, and we have an item to come back to you about that topic. And then another related item that allows development entitlements to be calculated prior to street dedication, so you're not penalized by dedicating some street space. So those previous items are all in Table 1, which are the suggested changes we received from PSC. We also have a Table 2, which are primarily technical amendments, in many cases identified by BDS, as well as some changes intended to bring consistency with some of the details that emerged with the RIP. All of these retain the basic emphasis of a regulation. It doesn't drop any regulation or entirely change it, but they are relatively technical refinements to improve implementation. And I wasn't going to go through these unless there's specific items that commissioners identified as needing some discussion. I did not receive any emails since last week, but I did want to pause here for a moment.
Okay. Any questions? It's just so clear, Bill. Thank you.
All right. And you still have an opportunity if you have another chance to take a look at things and things come up, you will have a chance over the next week or so. All right, I'm going to pass things on to another revisited item, our displacement risk analysis.
Okay. Good afternoon, Commissioners. So I wanted to just go back over and review the displacement risk analysis that we had prepared way back last May prior to the hearings on this project, just to reground us with a caveat that this analysis, the risk analysis that we have been doing is an iterative process. And one of the things that we found last summer when we brought this forward was, hey, you told us we like the Better Housing by Design risk analysis. Hey, RIP project, why don't you go do something similar? And so we went off and did that, and that's what you saw in your RIP deliberations. I would say when you go back, we go back and look at what we did last May. It's a similar approach to RIP, but it's a simpler approach to RIP. And it's simpler in a couple of key ways. One is there is, in this memo, there is no direct comparison to the comp plan. So when you see these numbers, it's the incremental change. We assume that the comp plan is the base, and we're looking at, well, what difference does the Better Housing by Design project make? So we're just looking at that incremental change. And I think the other is that it is and some work we have to share here, but in it is a simpler financial feasibility analysis. For the RIP analysis, we did a lot of work with Jerry Johnson on pro formas and the cost of development and what rents you can get. For this analysis back last May, we did a much simpler approach in that we went back and looked at actual development projects and then traced it back to see what developers were actually paying for those development sites to get a cost per square foot, and then use that to apply, as I'll explain, to apply as a price level or what developers are willing to pay for multifamily development sites. So a little bit simpler than what we got into with RIP. And I think to Chris's point earlier when talking about the RIP letter, I think looking for the general trends is the key takeaway here rather than the precise numbers. And we'll talk about what those trends are. Again, Bill had shown this earlier, this map of where the multifamily dwelling zones are. And by the nature of the map, and what we really focused on are the RM1 and RM2 zones. So the lighter pale blue areas, and then the next darker shade. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the RM2 and RM3 zones, but in the RM1 and RM2, that's where we're making a change from dwelling units per acre to the floor area ratio. And so that's where we have the key change in terms of changing the development dynamic. Developers now have a little more flexibility to do, instead of townhouses, they can do apartments. And that's really the dynamic and the change that we were looking to measure through this. The RM3 and the RM4, it's 2-to-1 FAR in the RM3 today. It'll be 2-to-1 FAR when this gets adopted. In the RM4, it's 4-to-1 FAR. It'll be 4-to-1. It's 4-to-1 today. It'll be 4-to-1 when it gets adopted. So we really focused in on where those RM1 and RM2 zones are. And that is where the challenge or the burden of these changes begin, is that a lot of that zoning and capacity is out in East Portland and along 82nd Avenue. And so that's where our more vulnerable communities are. And that's what this analysis showed. And so, I think when we look at our multifamily capacity, 85% of it has something on it there today. Most of that is about half of that is single-family homes, existing single-family homes that we have over the years zoned to assume is going to be redeveloped by virtue of their location on these corridors and in the centers. I think where Better Housing by Design does I would say a better job than RIP is that we have a lot of benefits that come with it to mitigate those impacts. Not only are we increasing the housing capacity, and we had a lot of the better design aspects of it, the increased open space, the reduced parking area, that really came off of some of the earlier studies we did about healthy, active living in these apartment locations. But then we also have a lot here for affordable housing. We're doubling the inclusionary housing bonus. We have this new deeper affordability bonus when at least half the units are affordable. We're allowing the transfers of the unused floor area off of existing affordable housing projects to be transferred to other development sites that can generate some revenue to help help preserve and rehabilitate that existing affordable housing, and then as in these change package, the new bonus for visitable units. And this is just the example of that deeper affordability bonus as it applies to the RM1 and RM2 zones for those projects that have at least half their units affordable. As I said, we had a similar analysis to RIP, but we really focused on the incremental change And then the other difference is that we were really we're focused on the changes in our buildable land inventory to the capacity and not to the allocation of where we think the growth will actually occur. That was sort of a point in time in our ability to analyze that and to our ability to sort of analyze both Better Housing by Design and RIP at the same time. And so at that time, we chose to focus on the capacity, like where is the potential opportunity for this to happen rather than the likely outcome. And then, as I said, we based it on the strike price financial feasibility model, which really shows, and we broke this down by market areas, again, like similar to what was done in the RIP analyses. This graphic up here on the left, you see, the projects that were in East Portland and along 82nd Avenue have a lower price that really reflects the rent levels that are achievable there. And you see that, sort of in that $25 to $40 range. And then as you get into some of the inner neighborhoods, you get the developers pay quite a bit more because they can achieve the higher rents. And so this really sort of was factored into and similar to what we found with the RIP analysis. Yeah, Eli.
We have there. Does this, you mentioned I think at the beginning, like 8% of the city is in these zones. Is this suggesting that we have a scarcity of this zoning type in some of the areas where the cost per square foot of multi-dwelling zoning is the highest?
Well, I don't know that we can dig deeper into the specific numbers. I think if you look at the map, my impression is we have a lot more mixed use in the inner neighborhoods, especially along our corridors, and that's sort of an equivalent building
I guess
type.
you have to
there.
look at both together. That's right.
I think you really do need to look at both together. In this, we're just looking at it as a standalone. The flip side is, I think, in the community planning process that went on in the 90s, we started with the Albina Community Plan. We did the Outer Southeast Community Plan. There was lots of rezoning, both mixed use and multifamily. And then we sort of ran aground in the Southwest Community Plan and shifted to a town center model. And so I think, and it's one of the things that we tried to correct through the 2035 comp plan process in our discussions with the David Douglas School District, is we pulled back some of that multifamily zoning in David Douglas. We didn't do a lot of up zoning of the multifamily in the inner neighborhoods. And I think one of the things that this shows us is, and sort of our intent is to get a new toolbox out of this project that allows us to revisit those inner neighborhoods and areas, to look at revisiting where our multifamily is and how it relates, especially as to when we see what happens with RIP and begin to look at each of those corridors.
I guess my the thought that's going through my head is this is a choice zone for multifamily affordable housing developments, both because of the bonuses and because you can actually find sites to do 40+ unit developments. And it would be important to get the mixed use, because mixed use zone worked for that as well.
Yeah.
But based on this, it would suggest that if you're trying to do those kind of developments, you're going to find lots of inexpensive per unit options at East Portland, 82nd Avenue, maybe St. John's, and you're unlikely to find places where you can afford to do it in terms of the land price in Northeast Portland, Interstate, Lair Hill for sure, inner Southeast Portland, Sellwood. So there may be from the affordable housing sector, I know people are always trying to find sites, especially with 2 bonds just passed. Where's this stuff going to go? It's going to
the market will tend to drive it to the lower cost multi-dwelling zone areas.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things with the Housing Bureau and their high opportunity policy and wanting to favor locations that have higher opportunity, more complete neighborhoods, and how you balance that decision making where it is a bit higher land values and costs, but they're better locations for people to live in. They're greater access to services and transit and everything. So I think it'll be interesting to see as both the Housing Bureau and Metro weigh the proposals they get. Do they go for more units on lower value land, or do they go for less units on better located land? But that's a challenge that they're gonna face. I will say that we have been fielding calls from affordable housing developers saying, the proposals are coming due this summer for the bond money. When is this going to be active? Because they want to take advantage of some of the bonuses in here, and a lot of interest in where we wind up with this whole package.
I have a question, and I'm sitting here trying to, figure out how to frame this. But in light of our deliberations on RIP, what I'm seeing is, if I'm understanding this graph correctly, and I may not even be understanding this graph, lower prices per square foot in East Portland. A lot of high price per square foot development northwest, let's say Lara Hill, inner neighborhoods. So it seems to me if you're going to be redeveloping in the inner neighborhoods, we're only going to end up with really expensive product, and so the displacement is even greater in potential in the inner neighborhoods through this project. Am I following this correctly? And again, with the frame of RIP,
yeah.
At least with RIP, and we had a lot of big debates on this, the redevelopment in the inner neighborhoods was creating, there was an argument by some greater housing choices that perhaps was bringing down rents. Whereas what I'm seeing is a greater cost per square foot, therefore an increase in rents. Yes?
I think if I understand your question correctly, I think it depends on a lot on who's living in the house today and how that changes. And I think one of the bigger, more important dynamics is whereas RIP, maybe you were getting one house and getting 3 or 4 in return. Now we're having one house and we're getting 6, 9 in return on that.
I might just mention that in terms of displacement, if you're talking about houses in inner neighborhoods, say on an interstate corridor or along the Southeast Division, the rents in those close-in neighborhoods are typically pretty high, and the analysis is not showing that much in terms of older apartments would be replaced by new housing. It's new multifamily housing under the proposals. It would be largely replacement of houses with multiple units. So in the inner neighborhoods, I think whether you would be displacing affordable rental houses, there does not seem to be a very large pool of existing affordable rental houses in the areas 3 miles from the central city. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So much of what would be replaced would be houses in the multifamily zones. Most of those houses in those close-in areas are not really affordable rentals currently. And you would get multiple units. And if you're doing inclusionary housing, some would have to be affordable.
Okay, I'm curious to see where my fellow commissioners land on this discussion.
And I think one of the purposes of today to review that is to get those questions, and then we can do more research and analysis and bring it back to the April 30th meeting. So,
quick question
yeah.
on your chart. What's the horizontal break line?
And the little black dots.
Yeah, you want to explain this chart? I mean,
Sure. So the horizontal black line in the middle of the blue boxes is the median. So is the middle of all of the range of prices that that we found for actual development projects. The blue box is
So
the
you didn't
first.
look at land prices. You looked at land prices as a component of a development project. So you went
This
back.
is transaction. We went back. We said, oh, that property has a 40-unit apartment building permit pulled on it. We went back into the assessor records and we looked back and said, oh, look, 2 years ago, the developer paid this much for that land. That's a cost per square foot. So this is what developers were actually paying for real projects.
So
not
a development in 2017, where the last land transaction was 1987, did you just discard that?
We discarded those. Yeah. Not long time sit on it. And so what you see is the blue boxes are the high degree confidence interval. Most of the sales fall within those blue boxes. The line is the next level out. The black dots above that are just outliers that we did not include in the analysis. So it really focus on the blue boxes of, that's where most of the transactions are falling in those neighborhoods. Yeah.
So did you have a lower number in the little squatty boxes? Is that because they're clustering more, or because there's fewer?
It's because they're clustering more, and you're seeing the wider, larger, longer blue boxes. We're seeing more variability there. I think I would describe it to just a range of different houses and locations and opportunities that developer find out there.
Yeah, like the Lair Hill one is, so much more variety there, but high.
Yeah, and I think some of this also depends on whether the developer, especially and this was shown a little bit in our feasibility analysis that Tyler covered before, is that I think in those inner neighborhoods you're seeing more of the apartment building types, and in the outer neighborhoods you're seeing more of the townhouse development types, and that has a factor.
So, Kat, I think what you're saying is correct. I think the target, though, is not, we're not looking at the 30 to 60% MFI folks that get displaced. We're looking at the 120 to 150%, which are, people who can't afford to buy a house in town, but they can't afford some amount of rent to be in town, and those are the ones that will get displaced by the apartment buildings.
I think that's, I'm not seeing anything that proves that assumption one way or the other. And that's my question back to the rest of the commission. I think there are some people who are renting multifamily or single family homes who are going to be displaced. And I guess there were a number of individuals on this commission who had a lot of concerns about that. So I was kind of poking to get those, especially who had concerns during RIP, to see if you had concerns with this, because I find it not consistent if you don't, personally. Yeah, Daisy.
So to clarify, this is the analysis from May of last year. And so since being a newer commissioner, will there be a newer analysis? Will there be a new analysis given changes to BHD since May?
So we weren't intending to do a new full-blown deeper dive similar to what was done in RIP, unless that's something that you guys really want and need to make a decision. We can analyze what we've got, and we can answer questions that you have similar to what Kat is asking about, and try and characterize what we have better. But if you want a deeper, more full-blown, add in another year of development history, we're not going to be able to produce that until July. Just given staff capacity and everything else, it really will take us until July to dig that deep into these questions. We can promise to do a similar analysis and present it to council and present it to you so you know what's going to council. But that's just sort of the realities of where we're at.
And follow-up question: given the information we have from past May, would it be possible to get something similar like we did with RIP, saying this is what we expect rent cost to be for new development under PhD?
Yeah.
And I guess this slide to me says it quite obviously. 2/3 of the sites are in East Portland. So to claim that all of those homes that we were seeing are not inhabited by people perhaps that are renting and in a lower price point, they're being affected. So I guess I'm just perhaps troubled by the inconsistency that I'm hearing in the silence. That's all. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I think it's really important to remember the difference in scale of the housing that's produced by Better Housing by Design. You know how part of our affordable housing or dealing with the increase in housing costs, that strategy is build as much program housing as you can, affordable housing, build as much housing as you can. And that's sort of, it's a two-pronged thing, and try to distribute where and how that happens fairly. When we did RIP, as we were doing that, it was hard to tease out how much additional housing you were getting for the risk of displacement that we were estimating. And on Better Housing by Design, the scale of the buildings is so much larger, and the need for that kind of multifamily housing can make such a difference that we think that puts it in a different scale.
I
But-
personally completely
Oh,
agree.
I get it. Okay.
I'm more poking my fellow commissioners because I'm surprised at the silence, I guess, to be honest, for those who are very concerned about RIP. Absolutely agree with what you're saying, Joe. And I absolutely, just as I was a proponent on RIP, I'm a proponent here. But I'm finding, like I said, I'm a surprised inconsistency with my commissioners. That's all. Katie, go for it.
Being one of those commissioners, I am kind of gathering my thoughts. I mean, actually having them show us this again, brings it up. Okay, so how can we be consistent here? And one of the things that I actually agree a lot with what Joe just said. I was really thinking of this, and it's like in a different compartment or something of my brain, kind of going, well, this is going to produce a lot of units, and that's something that's needed. Also, in at least with the East Portland Action Plan, they did kind of an analysis of not so much where low-income housing was, but where public low-income housing was. And so they came away realizing that actually East Portland didn't have any more than its share of public low-income housing. So that kind of affects the way I think about getting more units. Although, I mean, when we send our letter, if we're asking for mitigation, I mean, the people that would be selling their houses, and also the people that are living in those houses would benefit from the mitigation programs that we were asking for in the last letter with RIP. So it seems to me we would want to, say a similar kind of thing with this project.
I completely agree, but would you vote no on this proposal because it displaces people? Because, I guess that's kind of what I'm to be honest, what I'm poking at.
I don't know yet.
Okay.
I don't know yet.
Yeah.
And I also would like to know more about, like, I'm not sure about, in the study that you did, whether it included how much new low-income housing would be generated because of the incentives that are built into it. Because that's a whole nother factor. We didn't put a lot of incentives into the RIP.
But RIP's rate dropped rental rates throughout the city, and that didn't. There seemed to be an expression more of concern about displacement and mitigating displacement than if I was hearing the deliberations correctly. Joe's been trying to jump in there.
Well, and I forgot the other part, which is where Bill and Tom started. The other big difference between better housing by design and residential infill is that because of the kind of development and the size of development we're talking about here, we have mitigation tools built into the proposal that just didn't pencil for RIP, so we couldn't build them in. So that there was a bigger gap. There's inclusionary housing theoretically included in many of these projects, depending on how big they are. There's other incentives that are embodied in the program in the proposal. And when you look at this map, the zoning that we're showing here, this is not a dramatic increase where we have multifamily zoning today. This is an improved product, improved regulations to get a better product on those sites that were rezoned for multifamily in the 80s. So it's sort of actually in a better way living up to this promise of what we can deliver if we increase the supply of multifamily housing in a better way than we could when we made those sort of commitments originally in the 80s. This is a better multifamily housing with more benefits to the residents, and we think potentially able to produce more units. So that's part of the formula.
Eli's been trying to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's a good. I support the poking at this logic. I think that if you live in a house that's being taken down for redevelopment, it doesn't matter if it's being replaced with a triplex or a 50-unit development, right? That's where I think that if we're screaming about RIP, we should be screaming about this too. Because if the RIP analysis on displacement wasn't taking into account the new homes being developed, it was fairly fine-grained lens. That's mixing some metaphors, but it was really focused in on people, vulnerable residents in existing homes being taken down without looking at the other side of the equation about what more affordable options are being created as less expensive housing, not regulated, affordable to any. In this project, we're seeing a large number of people probably vulnerable folks in homes being taken down for this project. And now we're hearing the argument, which I think is valid, that in multi-dwelling zones, you can achieve more benefits on the supply side, regulated or unregulated, but there still are those people. So I guess I would hope that we have consistent. If those who spoke up on one just speak up on the other, like if there's concern, then it's for those people in the homes. And I agree with Katie that whatever programs are out there, and maybe it'll come back to our group to figure out what those displacement programs look like. It doesn't matter which project it is. They'll be important to have, get some best practices out there for those who are displaced for either reason. Based on regardless of which zone they're in.
Daisy, were you trying to maybe lean in? Did I see that in the corner of my eye? No? Okay.
I just might mention one thing. If anyone wanted to dive far back to our assessment report, we did have an appendices that looked at different areas that had concentrations of multifamily zoning that tracked demographic changes over time and rental rates and home prices. And that's interesting to look at. For example, 148th Avenue Light Rail Station area in East Portland has a lot of multifamily zoning. It went from being a place that had maybe houses on half-acre lots to 40 plus units on those same sites. And actually the demographics there have changed. It's actually become more diverse, actually more families with kids in those areas. So it's not an automatic assumption. I think, especially when you look at the economies of scale from going from 1 unit to 40 units, I think you have to look at the opportunity side of the additional housing as well. So not looking just at the one house that's lost, but the fact that the multifamily zoning has a certain scale where the opportunity additional housing unit side would need to be considered. I think that's one thing that's somewhat different between the two types of zones. And I think it has some relationship to why a lot of the nonprofit affordable housing developers projects tend to be not 1 or 2 units here and there, but sometimes a greater number of units in a somewhat larger multi-dwelling zone site. So it's hard to have a totally equal comparison between the two types of zones.
It totally support what you're saying and the argument. the two projects were trying to accomplish different things. The two projects caused displacement. RIP was, at least in my opinion, trying to create housing options at a different price point in all parts of the city. Granted, the uptake was different, just like we're seeing the uptake's going to be different here. And I'm having a hard time trying to put on the hat of my fellow commissioners who were concerned about the displacement in the RIP proposal, and just trying to tease out whether they're concerned about this or not. And if they are, then it's consistent and I get it. If not, I'm trying to understand that. That's, I guess, what it is. And if it's outlying, just outweighing, so I'm talking to you, Katie and Daisy and Teresa, and if it's because it's outweighing the production or the amount of units, that's, I guess, one way to look at it, certainly. And if it's really about just displacement, then I would imagine you'd be just as concerned with this proposal. I guess that's what I'm trying to get my head wrapped around. Go ahead, Teresa.
Okay, so I don't have a vote on this. So what I say is just what I think, but it's different. It's a different position now. From my perspective, this is some improvement of the style and shape of the housing. So these areas are already zoned for multifamily development. They have been for quite a while. So that's not a change to the use of the area or the planned use of the area. The displacement, I think, is real. And like Eli said, it doesn't matter where you live. If you get kicked out of your house and what's going to go there, it's still something that we have to deal with. So, and as Katie said, those programs, if we can put something in place to help people, regardless of the reason they're being displaced, whether it's for an apartment building or a fourplex or 20 ADUs, that's really important. And I think that's a consistent part. But this project is not actually changing the zoned use, what was already there and has been there for quite a while.
Okay. Go ahead, Daisy.
I will say that for me, the biggest thing with BHD versus RIP is that within BHD, I see a greater likelihood of somebody who may be displaced being able to stay in their neighborhood, because new units, because they're going to be multifamily units, they could take advantage of like inclusionary zoning, for example. So that's one of the biggest things for me as someone who has lived in East Portland, has been a renter their whole lives, and will probably continue to be a renter for a long time. That's where I see the biggest difference.
Okay. Go ahead.
I think that it's not part of this project, but the equity issue I would look at on this one is more the area of coverage, because the residential infill project, one of the big discussion items we didn't spend nearly as much time about was we made that mostly citywide. And if you look at where the blue places are on the map, are we looking at it now? Yeah, we can sort of see them here. There's, I once jokingly sent a planner a blue pencil just to have more chances to color in more of the map blue, but there's a relatively high amount of blue area, between 82nd and I-205. And there's not very much blue area in like this whole northeast. You can't see my screen here, but there are chunks of close in Portland where there's like almost no multi-dwelling zoning at all. So I guess that would be the lens I would look at, is that maybe we, I suspect there will be pushback to do halos of blue around the commercial corridors, for example, in close neighborhoods. But there might be a pretty strong equity case that, if we're going to be taking down one house to build 30, that might be a good place to do some of it. So I guess that, for me, the equity is more geographic, how this stuff gets distributed around the city. And I totally recognize this is not a mapping project. But I think that we have ahead of us at some point a mapping project related to where the zones applied. And I know historically R2.5 was used closer in and R2 was used further out. But the way those... And they're kind of evolving, those two zones in parallel. But I think that that's what I see as sort of the more of the equity concern for me.
Joe, were you trying to jump in?
No, I think, Eli, we're creating a new tool with this. That's why we're really anxious to move it forward, too. And between this and whatever happens with RIP, and the anti-displacement effort that comes out of the deliberations around RIP, you have a really solid middle housing sort of code now that we can put this new Better Housing by Design tool type of zoning on more sites, bring it back into the inner neighborhoods as well. So that is part of the promise of what we're doing here. But that'll be a separate process and a separate deliberation.
Okay. Well, in general, we'll probably belabor this. I'm not hearing a lot of people jump in for the conversation. I guess I do have one question, my fellow commissioners, though, is it seems to me that as this project follows on the heels of RIP at council understanding our position differently, or why we took the position of completely, for those who took the position of voting no on RIP, because of displacement, I don't think the letter describes it well enough if they're going to then vote yes on this. Like, there's some nuance there that I'm hearing that isn't really relayed in that letter. And one of the nuances, for example, that I'm hearing is preservation of neighborhoods. Is, if I'm understanding what Teresa was saying, was a little bit of putting more units into a neighborhood was uncomfortable, especially in the lens of displacement, versus putting more units in a corridor. Is that, did I kind of summarize that in a sentence well enough? I mean, I don't know if Katie or Daisy feel that way. I think Daisy was talking about a little bit more preservation of community within a geographic area. And so, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of these two coming through. And if I'm council, trying to understand what we as a group were thinking. Good challenge, I guess.
Yeah, well, just in relationship to the more units, it's if you put in a 40-unit building where there was a house or two, I don't think you could fit it in where there's one house. But anyway, on a corridor, it's a completely different feel than if you put in a 4-unit duplex that's brand new and the rents on that, each one of those is more than the rent on the house that was there. You know, it is a different feel. So I think you did capture that.
Okay.
So I heard two things. I heard Daisy looking for more information about the expected rent levels for the new development, and I heard Katie ask about what we think might the opportunity be for new affordable units through inclusionary housing, and we can try and do some analysis to come up with some estimates for that. Is there any other piece of analysis data that we could bring back for April 30th that would help enlighten this part of the conversation?
Just jumping back, not responding to yours, Tom, but Kat, you were sort of challenging those who are concerned with displacement. And I guess as we think about our letter to RIP and then what's going to follow, I think we should give the council some basis for it. And my concern is in RIP, there's displacement applied to, I think when we washed it all out, there was 100 and something number of people, low-income people, living in single-family houses, renting them, that would be displaced. And there was a concern that those people might well be predominantly African-American and other minorities. And as I read the concern, we're displacing people. And the equities didn't matter in terms of, even though on the whole there will be fewer displacements, the fact remained that RIP was going to take 100 and something low-income renters and displace them. And in this case, as I ran the numbers you showed us, there'd be 107 families. I got there by taking your 95%, and that 50% of them are in East Portland, and came up with the number 107 renters in East Portland are going to be displaced by Better Housing by Design. Now, we didn't do the detailed analysis to know which neighborhoods, how predominantly African-American or minority they are, but the fact remains. So I'm just, I guess, picking up on Kat's challenge, and I think we have to begin to answering the challenge in the RIP letter. Here's why we are so concerned about whatever the number was in RIP, 100, 200 families that are likely to be displaced, and these are likely to be predominantly low-income minorities. And the equities of RIP don't outweigh that displacement. It's still those families, and we don't like it. And until there are better programs in place, we can't support RIP. Then they're going to get better housing by design, and there'll be 107 families. Same situation. But somehow the equities, the totality of the equities in better housing by design warrant pushing those 107 families out. I'm having a hard time imagining, I'm a city council person, understanding, well, how do I balance these equities and what makes the difference? It's still a family, a low-income family, being displaced. And that ultimately was what drove RIP. It didn't matter that on the whole, there'll be less displacement. It didn't matter on the whole, there'd be more. In other words, the equity stacked up pretty well in RIP, but that wasn't enough. And so I'm trying to understand, I guess, going where Scott was starting. I think as a commission, whether we voted for or against RIP, we need to reconcile that, because otherwise we do look like we just throw out data and it doesn't really matter. Because in any zoning project we're going to do, you're going to find somebody living somewhere who's a low-income person that might be better off if we hadn't done that zoning project. And if that's all it takes, we're going to be facing this challenge every time we do a major zoning overhaul, because there'll always be a displaced person.
I think, Eli, you did have your hand up first, and then Teresa.
What I would like to convey to City Council with this project, one way or the other, is that there'll be displacement as part of it. And the bad scenario would be City Council gets both these code updates and they say, well, RIP displacement is a big issue, throw it away. This project, displacement not called attention to, well, let's just do this one. I mean, that would be, I think, a disappointing outcome. And so I think that at least providing City Council enough information so that they know that there's displacement both ways. The analysis you just threw out there, Jeff, like all the RIP analysis was baseline versus RIP, like the incremental displacement, because we know there's displacement happening in the single family zones, and RIP actually decreases the displacement in the single family zones. On this project, I don't know whether these numbers are baseline, current code versus, is it the delta or is it just number of displacement?
It's the delta.
Okay.
So
so in this case, also there's going to be displacement no matter what, and the numbers you're sharing are the increase of displacement, or it's increase of displacement.
It's an increase in displacement that we think will happen.
Right. So in that case, this project in that way, this project is worse than RIP, because RIP showed a decrease in displacement across the city, including in neighborhoods where there's low minority residents. And this project is showing an increase of displacement across the city compared to the baseline. So in that sense, this project has more mitigation, but it's also got more displacement compared to baseline. So I think that's probably fair to share. Anyway, I haven't really thought that through myself, but it seems like it's true.
Go ahead, Teresa.
So, Jeff, in response to your numbers, which are in response to just, looking at what you said, which is true, I just want to remind you, the council did vote to go ahead with RIP. So this commission did vote to go ahead with a RIP. So that is, they said displacement, but okay, go. And so if this is displacement, but okay, go, those are consistent votes from the commission as a whole. So it maybe says something that's hard to swallow right now, that we just don't, it's just not that big of a deal. We got to move forward, and we're just going to go do that, and we'll try to help people if we can. So, those are two consistent votes if they come. What you're speaking about that may seem to be inconsistent or speaking out of both sides of your mouth is the extra part to the letter. And so I think from that perspective, you're right. You have to make some decisions and what, as a council or commission, you want to support going forward. And if it's not the displacement stuff, then I certainly would not put that in the letter.
I guess briefly to respond, my concern was more displacement is now becoming a major consideration, a major lens we're using. And it was almost enough to take down RIP. It still might be once council gets a hold of it. And I think we just have a tough job to figure out what is displacement, how are we going to evaluate and measure displacement? Because these are all new forms of data. They're all pretty based on new speculations and assumptions. And we kind of grabbed onto the first displacement analysis we were given in RIP and said, yes, this is bad. And we almost, we're going to send a message to council that, whoa, this is really a close call. This displacement may be enough to stop RIP. Well, we're going to be confronting this again and again. We're now confronting with BHD, and I think we need to come up with a coherent analysis and policy about how we're using this displacement analysis, because to me, it's a very squishy concept to put into numbers and say, this much displacement we'll accept, this much we won't, because we're learning there's a slightly different approach to this analysis in this case than we used in RIP. So I'm just struggling to know how going forward we're going to manage the displacement factor when we deal with large zoning projects.
Chris, Daisy, do you need to jump in before I kind of go around?
No, go ahead.
So Chris, Daisy, Ben, and Joe.
So I'm a little concerned that this discussion is going off in an unproductive direction. To me, the two projects are apples and oranges. I think both are good for housing opportunity in the long run, and I'm supportive of both. With RIP, there was kind of a closer balance between the kind of opportunity we were creating and the kind of risks we were affecting. I think with BHD, the range of opportunities we're creating are much greater. They're numerically larger and they're for a broader range of incomes. So I think it's perfectly rational to be concerned about displacement in RIP and not as concerned about displacement in BHD. And I think there's maybe what we're getting at is there was sort of a tinge to our RIP discussion that increasing the displacement risk, and we are talking about risk versus actuality, right? I mean, all we can talk about is risk, but increasing the displacement risk for even one household ever is not acceptable. And I think that's a standard that we'll never achieve, and I think even trying to aim for that can have deleterious effects. So I just want to, I think trying to create some equivalences between the two projects may be an unproductive direction to continue going down. That's just my 2 cents.
I agree that I feel this is unproductive. I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's information that we had with RIP that we don't have with BHD. For example, with RIP, we had 2 displacement risk analyses. One that provided a high level of detail that we don't have for this project. 2, to Jeff's point, displacement has been happening. Displacement has been a concern. It's new that the city now conducts, from my understanding, I may be wrong, it's new for the city to conduct displacement risk analyses and to have more of an equity lens. That may be new, and I think maybe that's why we've seen more of a push to really look into displacement recently, but that the city is finally taking it into account. This should have been happening all along. And again, I want to reiterate, and I also think it's really important to listen to, try to really hear out the people who've experienced displacement, who've worked with people who have experienced displacement, who maybe live in East Portland or grew up there or live somewhere where it's going to be redeveloped. When we say that we have less of a concern because it will create more of an opportunity for people to stay in their neighborhoods. And when I talk about displacement, I am talking about community preservation, because if you are low income, if you're a person of color, if you're an immigrant, place is really important, right? Where your children go to school, where people from your community are, if they're close to you, and then you're displaced, and then you have to go somewhere far where you don't have these resources as you did before. So that's why, again, I feel that under BHD, there's a greater opportunity for people to stay in their neighborhoods, and I think that's really valuable.
I'll be very brief because I feel like we're beleaguering this, but I totally agree with Chris. I think displacement is one of the key factors we want to consider when we look at long-range actions, any kind of, not just this. I would think it's key, though, to say it's not the only or the key factor. So there's other elements that we have to consider as a whole. So as we look at what the benefits are, it's definitely a lens that we want to look at, and then totally take the point that it's something new that we're still grappling with, and maybe this is some of the growing pains that we're dealing with right now.
Okay, Joe, did you want to jump in still?
Well, just the common message between both projects, and it's actually in our letter too, is that there's this realization now that a more robust and sort of anti-displacement set of tools and programs is needed. Regardless of either of these two projects, it's just needed baseline. In our comp plan, where we put in policies to express an interest in that. So this is a moment where that's actually is emerging at the same time as these two projects. So I think it's going to complement the whole package.
Thank you. I think we can move on. I do just want to just a little bit with what Daisy says. So Daisy, thank you. And I just want to make sure you were talking about the different set of analysis that we had at RIP. And I think part of the reason I'm also was kind of trying to get a feel for this is I don't think at this point in time, as Tom said, there's any intent to have the same level of analysis, quite the same, for this project. And so if that's going to cause consternation on anybody's point, now is the time we need to let that be known. And we can certainly do that through emails if we want later too. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and I think our commitment is to mine the data that's in the work that we've already done to answer the questions you've put on the table, because we think we can do that, and that the two projects are different enough that this will give you confidence in the ability to vote on better housing by design. And so that's what we'd like to try to come back with.
And I think that the same as, what Bill said for like all of the code changes in here, if over the next week, as you ruminate on this discussion and there are other questions that come up and you want to send them to us, we'll do our best to bring back answers on the 30th.
Thank you.
All right, I'll be moving on to another set of topics, very different from what you just discussed. You have to change gears here, very, very different.
Moving to the worksheet.
And yep, the large worksheet is what is the basis for this discussion. And these items we'll be discussing are things that are not in the revised proposed draft. So whichever direction you might provide for these would be revisions from what you have in the revised proposed draft. And in some cases, there are things we're bringing back per PSC request. So the three items are East Portland minimum site frontage requirements, historic district zoning, and FAR transfer allowances for seismic upgrades. Just jumping into the East Portland narrow sites analysis, you might recall that we're trying to address some site issues that are fairly unique to East Portland. These are sites in this image where the sites are generally about 60 feet wide by 300 feet deep. And you can see what's happening with the individual lot development. It's either one half of the lot is the building, the other half is vehicle maneuvering area. And these sites, these are in areas with large blocks where we don't have good street connectivity to make it easier for people to reach local destinations, and there's not enough space for any additional connections with those narrow sites. Also not getting a good site design, again, pretty predictable in the outcome. And the proposal we had was to, in areas where you had sites more than 160 feet deep, to require for new development to happen, require a minimum site frontage of 90 feet. And the intent of that is to move us from the typical arrangement you're getting on those sites, just, again, no space for street connections, not a lot of opportunity for better site design, to encourage site consolidation, to really get better configured sites and to improve outcomes, both in terms of the design outcomes as well as the street connectivity in East Portland. There are exceptions for sites that are, say, adjacent to or landlocked by already developed sites. You're exempt from the proposed minimum site frontage requirement, since you would not have an adjoining site you could join with. What we were asked to do during the October 9th PSC work session was to take a closer look at this regulation and take a look at how broadly it would affect development. Are there many sites out there that would be affected by this? There are 4 areas in East Portland that are mapped for this requirement. There are areas that have the larger concentrations of multi-dwelling zoning in East Portland, includes the J District, a large area around the Division Midway Center, 122nd and Burnside area, as well as the Rosewood Glenfair area, clustered around the 148th and 167 light rail stations. So what we did was we undertook an analysis to look at just how many narrow, deep sites we have here, and what opportunity is there for adjoining lots when they're underutilized to potentially join up. A key thing we were looking at is the extent to which underutilized sites per the buildable lands inventory were next to each other, or are they already developed, or are they isolated lots that really don't have much an opportunity to be combined with others. The three colors on this map, which you'll see in other ones, shows in yellow the full set of multi-dwelling zones. Blue are narrow, deep sites that are already fairly substantially developed. The pink are sites that are isolated and really don't have much of an opportunity to join up with other sites. And the red sites are ones that are adjacent to other underutilized narrow sites. The extent to which you have a lot of opportunity for lot consolidation varies by these areas. The J district, out of the 175 narrow lots we identified, about 40% were underutilized and adjacent. So there's still a fair degree, shown in the red, of the opportunity to affect the way future development would happen. Another area is Rosewood over by 148th. And here, out of the 63 narrow lots that would not meet the standard and would have to combine, about 47% of those are adjacent to one another. So there are a fair amount of opportunities to consolidate those sites before development happens. Somewhat different in the two other areas, 122nd and Burnside area in Hazelwood. Out of the 52 narrow sites there, just about 25% are underutilized and adjacent. So you can see it's really just a small number where there seems to be a good opportunity to have future development consolidate those narrow sites. 122nd and Division area, the narrow sites tend to be more scattered, and including a number of the pink sites you could see scattered here. There's just not a lot of a concentration of likely to redevelop sites that are adjoining one another. So about 24% of the narrow sites there are adjacent to one another and underutilized.
I just asked, what's the yellow again?
Oh, the yellow those are other multi-dwelling zone sites. So the white in those areas would typically be either mixed use or actually largely single family zone properties. So this proposal for that minimum street frontage would only apply in the multi-dwelling zones. And in this area, it only apply to these colored blue, pink, or red sites.
So the yellow are multi-dwelling zoned, but they are wide sites.
Okay.
So the standard would not apply.
They're more regularly sized. They don't have some of those really narrow, deep site situations. The requirement would apply to all these blue, pink, or red ones, just that the blue is not likely to redevelop because it's got development. And the pink would probably qualify for the exemption, being already adjoining already developed sites, and the red would be the sites where the regulation would have more of a real impact in providing opportunities for consolidating those sites into more regularly configured sites. And again, to remind you, the intent was to both to improve the site design as well as to provide more opportunities to have sites wide enough to provide additional street connections.
Bill.
I'm sure.
Oh, I have a question. So how would that play out on the ground? So you have a lot that's in the red. You'd be required to try to buy the one next door before you could develop it?
The way the regulation is set up is there's a minimum street frontage, and you could not do development unless you met that minimum frontage.
Okay, so
so you could not develop unless you combine, or there's an option to go through a planned development review. So a closer scrutiny of the design to improve outcomes. So there is an out for a project to be able to develop, even if they're one of these red sites adjoining to others.
So essentially it would sort of force at least 2-lot development. Okay, thanks.
Right.
Type 1, 2, or 3?
I'm sorry?
which type PD? What level of review is a PD?
I think it's. I'd have to double check. It's. I know it's the. I think it's based on numbers of units. I think it's if it's up to 30 units is a type 1. I'd have to double check on that, but I believe it's using an existing sequence of a lesser review for a smaller number of units. Yes, apparently that's correct.
Type 1 up to 30 units? Is that what I'm hearing? I'm guessing it'd be type 2 if that's a...
Oh, that's it.
Type 2...
Can you repeat that since
Sorry.
some of us couldn't hear it?
I think Teresa's making a fair point that if you're basically creating undevelopable lots, then the alternative threshold matters more to me. So that's why I'm asking this question.
Yeah. We could follow up on that and get back to you about the specific threshold. But yeah, there is a lower review for a smaller number of units and higher review for more units. I should mention that I talked to a planner involved in the East Portland Community Plan. Their assumption when they were working on that plan and applied the multi-dwelling zoning in some of these areas was that any development of multifamily would probably, as a matter of course, involve people consolidating the lots to come up with better site configurations. But we have very, innovative developers who found ways of developing on those individual lots. So not as much consolidation as my understanding as we had assumed would happen through the multi-dwelling zoning. Some of the assumption was by the very virtue of zoning to multifamily, that would bring about the new street connections we would want as people combine the lots to create clusters of apartments. It just hasn't turned out that way.
So this would be the perfect kind of opportunity for some anti-displacement help in the form of education, which is so that the adjacent property owners can understand the value of their land. If they're the one in the middle and there's two guys on either side who need bigger lots to develop, then that's, like I said, just an education piece to help that homeowner understand that there's value in that land based on a zoning configuration, which would not typically be a normal thing that the average Joe would just know.
No, that's a good point. I'm just going to put out there just the options. We weren't asked to put options out there for changes. During your straw poll, there was support for the staff proposal to require a minimum street frontage in these areas. But based on the numbers we have and the analysis, we did want to put out some options. One option is retaining the proposal as it is currently written and applying to these 4 center areas. One is keeping the regulation only for the 2 centers that have a larger proportion of adjacent underutilized narrow sites, which would be Jade and Rosewood areas, and dropping Midway and 122nd Hazelwood that have more scattered narrow sites. And the third potential approach would be just to drop their proposal entirely and depend on other tools to achieve our objectives, whether it's new, narrower types of street connections that PBOT's creating, and our allowances or requirements to reduce paved area for driveways and require deeper rear setbacks in East Portland. So these are the 3 options we're encouraging you to consider.
Thank you. And so, looking for an actual vote or a straw poll? Because there are amendments.
It'd be
How do you want to do this?
We would have to come back with the very specific regulations that
depending on how we vote. So straw poll.
Straw poll.
Can I make a point? I think we never did our disclosures. Are we supposed to do that?
Oh, yeah.
Not that we haven't talked about this. Well, we just talked about. I don't know if we need to.
Yes, if they. I'm sorry, I don't have the piece of paper that outlines who had something to disclose.
Well, I'm one of them.
Okay.
So I'll share. I own 2 pieces of property and have an ownership interest in a third that are multi-dwelling zoned. And they're all, one's almost sold, the other totally entitled. So I continue to participate.
I do have a disclosure too. OTAC, the firm I work for, was hired to do some code modeling and some initial brainstorming for this project, and I was the project manager for that. I actually do have a question for Bill. Are there other disclosures?
I think there are. So just to reinforce, so you feel that that prior work doesn't unduly influence your vote?
I don't think it does.
Perfect. Okay, Jeff.
Let's see. My house is in a multifamily zone, and I own 2 other properties in the city that are in multifamily zones.
And by voting on it,
I don't see how it would influence my vote in any way. There's no redevelopment potential on those properties.
there you go. Thanks.
And
Chris.
my principal residence is in a multifamily zone, but in saying that, I am similarly situated to thousands of citizens around the city, so I don't feel I have any special conflict here.
Thank you. Okay. Ben, I think, did you have a question or something? Or
Yes. So I appreciate you looking at these options, even though it was I think as a result of deeper analysis. As you went through these options, did you also think about possible incentives, or at least look at the incentive route? In other words, if you have a site and you combine the sites, were there options that you considered that would be viable to say, okay, well, you get extra XYZ?
In terms of making it the path of least resistance or an attractive thing to do to voluntarily consolidate, what we did were some of the proposals have already discussed, such as, well, because you'll typically need a 20-foot wide driveway, regardless of whether it's a narrow site or a wider site. Some of our limitations on the vehicle area will make it harder to develop the individual site. So in terms of creating an incentive to combine, some of the regulations would make it harder, and then it therefore becomes easier and maybe a kind of incentive to combine. We also have the proposed requirements for deeper setbacks, and it'd be harder to achieve that on these narrow sites. It'd be easier to achieve some of these things if you combine sites. We had discussed with transportation if there are ways we could sweeten the deal in terms of projects providing site area for streets, and there are a number of things that in terms of having a larger site and potentially providing street space, we do have proposals that make it less painful to provide that street space. But there's no FAR bonus in going from a small site to a bigger site. The bonuses we had created for this project were really intended to focus on some of these high priority objectives, such as affordable housing. So we don't really have a specific incentive based on trying to get sites to consolidate. We'd be interested if people had any ideas as to what could happen in terms of a zoning code incentive.
Forward a little bit. I think that of those 3 choices, if I heard correctly, staff's kind of recommending the middle one. From my perspective, I think that this is an experiment. The middle one is where I'm inclined to go, number 2, because it includes the areas where it comes more often. The other areas just get dropped from the list. My interest in it is an experiment to try and improve site design, because I agree that the sort of the linear shot is a pretty unfortunate site design. I don't go into this expecting that it's really going to help with street connectivity. I'm kind of bearish on the strategies available thus far to try and influence developers to actually pay the city, pay for the street improvements to connect through. I think that's going to take a more resource side and more incentive side to actually see it ever happen. But I say just from a site design perspective, I would support the second approach. Yeah.
Katie had her hand up, and then I see Mike's.
Yeah, I had to leave the room for a minute, but I did want to say that it's pretty central to my one of the things that I really love about Better Housing by Design is the idea that it's trying to work with unfortunate long lots that are in East Portland that almost sort of it's hard. They almost doom it to bad design. And so when you drive around in East Portland, you'll see all these apartments with just, you know, this, it's like these little alleys, but they're not really alleys, they're parking areas, and people are living, and then there's just one after another after another. And so I'm really bullish on this part of it, and I would even go for one, but a two would be acceptable to me, but to drop it entirely, I wouldn't go for that at all.
Mike?
Well, I think it's a great idea, and I don't understand why we would cut two of them out. One of them was at 25%, I think, and if it's a good idea, I think it's a good idea for all four. But so I could go either way, but if you're going to do it, do it.
Okay. Does anybody else have a comment before we kind of just do a consensus vote? Nope. Okay. So all of those in favor of option 1, raise your hand. Sure. But that was 3-6. Okay. All in favor of option 2? Well, at the moment, option 2 is winning.
I'll give my thought. I got persuaded, right? I mean, I think that my reason for going with sort of the idea of dropping those two is because it's a lot of regulation over a pretty big geographic area, and there's like 8 lots affected. I don't know if that's quite that simple, but there's not very many lots in those areas when staff actually looked at them. So I thought, maybe it's going to confuse developers. They have this huge, I'm in the 122nd Hazelnut tract. Does this apply to me? And it applies to almost no one. But if it's a helpful design tool that's going to help dissuade people from building even just a few long, snouty developments, then I'm okay having it more broadly used. So that's what convinced me, is that if it's really going for the design, then it's design over code complexity is where I'm hitting it. Okay.
Sure. Yep. Let's try again. Option 1, raise your hand. 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Option 2, raise your hand. 1, 2. Okay, there we go. It's option 1.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our topic 2, and I should do a time check. Julie, how much time do we have?
We have till 3:30.
Okay, we'll see if we can get through this. Other topic, and this came from discussions we had, including one during our November PSC work session, and it related to the fact that some of our highest density multifamily zoning, in fact, the larger scale zoning outside the central city, including the mixed use zones, are close in historic districts. The existing RH zone that has a 4-to-1 FAR, it's a bigger scale than is allowed in the mixed use CM3 zone, applies largely in the Alphabet Historic District in Northwest and the Kings Hill Historic District. As I got that existing 4-to-1 FAR area in green, the other RH area has a 2-to-1 FAR. Currently, they all have the zone label of RH. So there is this opportunity as part of this project to determine between the new RM3 and RM4 zones, what's the appropriate landing spot to shift from the existing RH zone. And what I'll be talking about is really focusing on these areas that have that larger scale zoning. One thing that fed into this is we had input both from the Historic Landmarks Commissioners and PSC Commissioners that highlighted 2 different aspects related to these areas. Landmarks Commissioners highlighted that for their reviews, which everything in an historic district needs to go through a review with Historic Landmarks Commissioners in terms of new development. Context is pretty key, and the base and bonus scale may not be approved by them if they determine that it's out of scale with the historic context. What we heard from PSC members was a priority on being able to provide incentives for affordable housing and housing options in general in historic districts, especially since they are typically in such close-in high opportunity areas. And these priorities really have a basis in our policies. We do have comprehensive plan policies related to preservation that do talk about integrating new development with the historic patterns. Policy 4.49 talk about refining the base zoning to take into account character of historic resources and districts. Of course, we also have policies that prioritize locating housing in centers and high opportunity areas, which all of these historic districts are. What staff wanted to do, based on some of the input we received from PSC and the Historic Landmarks Commission, was to see if we could explore ways of balancing those concerns about the appropriate scale in historic districts with retaining opportunities for new housing and providing incentives for affordable housing that have a realistic chance of being used and as serve as a real incentive for affordable housing. Related to the Landmarks Commission concern that our base and bonus FARs may not be appropriate for the scale of the historic districts, we also wanted to look at, well, what is the scale out there? These historic districts are amongst our largest scale historic districts in terms of having larger historic buildings. So again, we focused on the Alphabet and Kings Hill historic districts. RM3 and RM4 are the new assigned zones for these areas. Again, assigning these zones based on the existing FAR allowances. And the RM4 zone has a base of 4-to-1 bonusing through inclusionary housing, for example, to a 6-to-1 FAR. And that larger scale zone, RM4, was a particular concern to the Landmarks Commission. They were concerned whether they could approve any of these projects with inclusionary housing in terms of being able to approve the additional scale that comes along with that inclusionary housing bonus. We did some analysis of just looking at what is the existing scale of development in the historic districts, and this is focusing on the Alphabet Historic District. The light pink is showing existing buildings that are up to a 2-to-1 FAR. And then the darker tones are showing buildings ranging from 2 to 3-to-1, and the darkest being more than a 4-to-1 FAR. The dots are showing historic landmarks or contributing structures in the historic district. So those are the older historic buildings. And you can see it's a pretty broad array of development scale in these areas. A key thing we wanted to look at is what is the upper end of the historic scale of buildings, perhaps to serve as a guideline for what the upper end of the development allowances could be, so that there is some alignment between what our zoning allows and what would pass muster when you're focusing on a historic scale. And looking at the area east of 21st, which has that existing 4-to-1 FAR, these were amongst the larger buildings in the area. So the larger buildings tended to range from about a 3-to-1 to almost a 4-to-1 FAR. Typically, the 4 to 5 story buildings are right about that 4 to almost 4.5 to 1 FAR. We also looked at the Kings Hill Historic District, and actually a not so dissimilar array of scale. The bigger buildings, including some of the towers, were generally ranging up to about 4.5 to 1 FAR. The towers might be surprising. They're not contributing structures, and they are less boxy. They often are more slender than the historic buildings, so it's a lesser FAR than you might think for having a 8 to 12 story building. This did get us thinking about whether we need to adjust the FARs, the base and bonus FARs in that RM4 zone. And what we came up with in terms of if we were to align the allowances in zoning with the general scale of the historic fabric, and again, especially looking at the larger historic buildings, we came up with an approach that would set a base FAR in the RM4 zone in historic districts of a 3-to-1 FAR. That would be the same as the mixed-use CM3 zone, and then providing a 50% increase through inclusionary housing and other bonuses, allowing bonuses up to 4.5 to 1 FAR generally. But for the deeper affordability bonus for projects where at least half the units are affordable at 60% MFI, still retaining an allowance to get up to a 6 to 1 FAR. Just wanted to highlight a few things here. In fact, I'm going to run through this proposal and kind of come back to the specific points for your discussion. So that 3-to-1 base up to 4.5-to-1 bonus FAR would accommodate the range of a scale of historic buildings in those historic districts. I also wanted to identify some existing larger buildings in that area, including this Buck Prager building in the middle that was recently approved. These buildings also would be within that 3-to-1 to 4.5-to-1 FAR bonus range. Another component, so keep that one in mind, the idea of RM4 zone going to a 3-to-1 base FAR instead of the 4-to-1. Another thing we're looking at was rethinking where we apply the RM3 and RM4 zoning. Currently, the larger scale RM4 zoning is east of 21st and west of 21st. It's the lower scale RM3 zoning. We're looking at the idea of reorienting it based on the historic scale so that the southern area towards Burnside is the larger RM4 scale and the northern portions become the smaller scale RM3 zone. And why are we looking at that? One, you may have noticed that this map showing existing building scale, the larger buildings tend to be clustered south of Gleason down towards Burnside, and the larger buildings are actually on both sides of 21st. You wouldn't know looking at the existing FARs that it's smaller scale between 21st and 23rd. And generally, the smaller scale historic buildings are in the northern areas of that area. So that's one thing that's informing some of our consideration here. This is looking at that area between 21st and 23rd, just a closer look at what's there. This is an area that has a 2-to-1 FAR as a base FAR. And some of the existing buildings here are twice the scale of what is allowed in that area. These are showing some buildings in that area. Again, this is the 2-to-1 base FAR area. And these are about twice the scale that's currently allowed in that zone. This is moving up north, up towards Gleason, also some larger buildings well in excess of that 2-to-1 FAR. And one thing to bear in mind is there hasn't been any demolition of historic structures here, but there are still areas such as parking lots that could be development opportunities. This particular area has a large office parking lot in the RH zone here on Everett. And what could be built currently here would be half the scale of those historic apartment buildings. And this is the Trader Joe's parking lot. What could be built there is half the scale of the adjoining apartment buildings. So in terms of thinking about historic context as a guide for what you might allow, in this case, historic context is bigger than what our current zoning allows. If you look further north, you do see a lot more small lot development of houses, plexes, small apartment buildings. And you see that at both sides of 21st, whether it's the smaller scale RM3 proposed area or the RM4 area. This is not universally the case. The area always has a fairly large mix, but the general pattern is smaller buildings northward and larger ones towards Burnside. So two components to what we're talking about here. One is applying the RM4 zoning between 21st and 23rd south of Gleason-Hoyt, and shifting east of 21st north of Gleason from the big RM4 zone down to RM3. So the net effect would be shifting where the larger scale zoning is to a north-south arrangement. I had spoken to Rick Michelson about this, who is a past planning commissioner and who was involved in some of the discussions about what FARs to assign. And this is all prior to the historic district designation for the area. And apparently some communities were pushing for a 2-to-1 FAR for the whole area. City Council was interested in 4-to-1, and they kind of split the baby by just dividing it on 21st. And Rick Michelson's take was, if you were to look at historic fabric as a guide, a different orientation would have been better. All right, the third component, other than the first two we talked about, is looking at Kings Hill. And here too, we're looking at some adjustment to the new zoning designations. Again, all this is now RH zoning, and the question is which new zone does it land on? And I'm going to highlight areas we're focusing on to the southern portions of the districts. In the southern area, we have a number of edge areas with fairly small lots, usually with house-type structures, and they have that RM4 zone. They're close to light rail stations, so they have a 100-foot height allowance. And so that applies to this corner here, which in the aerial is here, as well as I think it's a Portland Garden Club and a large house here. And it's adjacent to R5 zoning here. Now, interestingly enough, this area outside the historic district has just the standard RH going to RM3 zoning designation. Now, this area is in the Central City Plan District, so things to be aware of is that the Central City Plan District assigns a 4-to-1 FAR, and in 2 of the blocks, they already have a 100-foot height allowance. If we were to shift this area to a RM4, it would allow greater height in this block. And the buildings here are already more than what's allowed in that, would be allowed in the RM3 zone. I think 65 feet is a maximum, and some of these buildings are over 80 feet tall. So what we are thinking about is the idea of switching these designations, having some of these small scale properties at the edges of the historic district, in the historic district, go to an RM3 zone, and have the properties outside the central city or outside the historic district switch over to an RM4 zone. And we would see that designation as being more of a truth in zoning situation, reflecting the fact that Central City assigns a 4-to-1 FAR to that area. It would be clearer than assigning an RM3 zone. So 2 components here. One, switch these smaller properties here to an RM3 designation instead of RM4 within the historic district, and switch outside the historic district to the larger scale RM4 zone. So a number of moving pieces here. One thing we just wanted to make you aware of, in one of your past work sessions, you provided direction to allow bonuses and transfers to be used in mixed-use zones in historic districts. Currently, as of, I think, May of 2018, we imposed an FAR limit to those areas, which caps the FAR at 2.5 to 1. And you can't achieve a 4-story scale there. And your direction would allow bonuses, FAR bonuses and transfers to more fully achieve a 4-story scale. And CM2 zone applies on Northwest 21st and 23rd and is the most common mixed-use zoning in historic districts outside this district as well. There's a reason why I broke down the components, because it's kind of confusing when you look at the full picture of potential changes. Basically, it's in the Alphabet Historic District going to an RM4 zone in the southern portions, RM3 in the northern portions, and switching some of the zoning in the southern stretches of the Kings Hill Historic District. And just to remind you of what those pieces are, to set you up for your discussion, oh, actually, one piece before we get to that. We also looked at what the impacts on housing capacity would be. We wanted to highlight that the broader neighborhoods that these are part of, the Northwest District Association and Goose Hollow, have capacity for over 12,000 additional housing units. The proposals, as we've outlined them, would result in a reduction in capacity of about 200 units, and that's only looking at the changes to the base FAR. We also we looked at an exercise of if we only looked at larger sites more than 10,000 square feet and assumed that you could achieve those FAR bonuses, there would be no loss in capacity if you assume that those larger sites developed with 20 or more units and provided inclusionary housing units. In terms of the development trends, these areas over the past 10 years have seen over 4,000 new housing units built. And only 8% of those units were in the historic districts. So these are areas where there has been a lot of opportunity for new higher density development. Over the past couple of decades, we've added a lot of mixed use zoning to the Northwest District. So the major producer of units in the Northwest District is north of the Alphabet Historic District. Besides those 4,000 units completed, there are a number of units in both neighborhoods under construction. So that's something to bear in mind, a moderate reduction in overall of capacity, looking at base FAR changes, but in terms of the overall capacity of the area is not a whole lot of difference. Yes.
Do you think that's developers? Do you think the avoidance of the historic districts is because of the difference of entitlement, or because developers are avoiding discretionary processes that they have to go through for the historic areas?
I can't answer that definitively, but one thing I can say is that the historic districts are fairly highly built out, so there aren't a lot of large vacant parcels. If you looked at the mixed-use zoning in the Northwest District, for example, there's still a lot of fairly empty blocks or sites that are transitioning from warehouses to more urban development. So part of it is opportunity sites. There's a lot more opportunity sites outside those small lot historic platting areas. Just a lot of development by the waterfront as well. So I think part of it is just a lot more opportunity sites. So just want to outline the three components to staff's idea of balancing the approaches for these areas. One, where you do have the RM4 zoning, bring the scale down to a 3-to-1 base and 4.5-to-1 bonus. Again, greater scale for deeper affordability bonus. 2 is switching the higher and less high density designations so that the higher density zones are generally south of Gleason, between Gleason and Burnside on both sides of 21st, and having the lower scale RM3 zone to the north of that. And the intention there is to better match the historic scale. And then Kings Hill doing a little bit of a switch in terms of where the RM4 and RM3 zoning is at the edge of the historic district. Switching to RM3 for some small properties that are primarily contributing structures, and switching over to the RM4 zone just outside the historic district. With that, I'll leave it to your discussion.
Can we maybe go, you had a slide where you had all three of them on one. Yeah, perfect. Okay. And can I just clarify for everybody, because I think this is the way I understood it, on 2A, that's only in historic districts, is that correct?
Yes. Okay. Outside of historic districts, they'd retain the 4-to-1 base bonusing to 6-to-1. And we are encouraging you to think of this as a package because a lot of this is intended to be fairly balancing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jeff?
Quick question before I start thinking about it all. When you have you want to switch some of the zoning, and you have original proposal, is the original proposal based on the existing underlying FAR?
Yes.
So in effect, just taking the Alphabet District, we'd be rezoning, in effect, through this decision.
This would be a departure from what we've done up to now. Previously, it was a non-discretion. Yeah, if you had a 4-to-1 FAR, you end up with RM4.
So we'd have property owners going, how did I lose
right.
FAR?
And the reason we did that here, because these were the largest scale zones.
I mean, I understand the rationale, and on one hand, I'm persuaded by the rationale, but I'm also very bothered by the rezoning effect that would have.
Over the last 3 months, we did a mailing to all the property owners in these areas to let them know that we were thinking about it, and we went out and had some community meetings, and we gave them Bill's phone number to call and talk to him. And then if this proposal goes forward, we will send a formal Measure 56 notice before the City Council hearing to let them know that this change is in the works, and they will again have the opportunity to become more informed by consulting with us and then providing testimony to council on this map change.
I was going to mention one thing because I did promise people that I'd relate what we heard from community members about these ideas. The Northwest District, they chimed in support of this idea of more of a north-south difference in scale. Although they didn't like the bonus FARs, they wanted us to tamp down on the bonuses, not provide so much scale. Kings Hill, they really they supported going smaller scale in the RM4 zone, but wanted to go further. They were asking that much of their area be downscaled to an RM3 2-to-1 FAR area. We also heard input from other community members who were more concerned about these areas being high opportunity areas. And their take was, we have a housing crisis. These are very close in high opportunity areas. Why would we tamp down on the scale in these very high opportunity areas. So very diverse range of perspectives we're hearing.
Go ahead, Teresa.
So I wonder if there's any merit to this thought. Since the historic district is mostly built out, there's a few opportunities in there that by retaining larger FAR, it would give a chance for the existing buildings to be able to sell their FAR and maybe like afford seismic upgrades like you're proposing later. So any thoughts?
The thought would be addressed by that next proposal we'll talk about, which part of the discussion, there was a concern that if you, some people call right size of zoning and try to better match the historic scale, then you are taking away the potential opportunity to transfer FAR, underutilized FAR from historic structures. So the next proposal was intended to provide additional FAR beyond your usual base FAR in conjunction with seismic upgrades. So the next one is intended to address that sort of conundrum.
Go ahead, Eli.
If we do the combined proposals you're showing here, the example you showed of a lot that's basically vacant with pretty high FAR structures on the sides of it, would that lot have an FAR up to what the structures are, or to still be less? Because I have an idea.
You get pretty close with the inclusionary bonus.
Yeah, especially the parking lot areas in this area actually are predominant in the southern areas. So if you're looking at the 3-to-1 base bonusing a 4.5-to-1 through inclusionary housing, assuming they have 20 or more units, the scale would be pretty similar to the larger buildings in the historic district.
Well, here's the idea behind the question is if we, in historic districts, what if we said that the FAR for a lot that doesn't have a historic structure on it is the greater of the FAR for the base zone or the FAR of the structures on the side of it? So that, because as we know, historic context is everything, so we wouldn't want the base zoning to pull down the possibility of development on those sites. That could go beyond just this district.
It could also means that you're going to be restricted in height. I mean, you happen to narrow in on some options that perhaps is allowing, let's say, some extra height, but you could have very well have a situation where the two historic buildings on either side of you were shorter. So it's going to go both ways. Just be careful what you ask for.
Or you have a site that has 4 sides, right? And so you're going to take the average of those 4 buildings, or what it would be 8 buildings if you get the.
I guess I obviously haven't thought it through all the way,
yeah.
but what's going through my head is that if we so often see, as Bill correctly pointed out, what passes muster with the Landmarks Commission, and for those, it took me a little while to learn this on the Psc, is that matters. I mean, they have the control over this, not us. If there's ever a zoning higher than what will pass muster with landmarks, they win. So, I mean, this would be a situation of like, well, are there some areas in the city where the context is higher than the base zone? Logically, you should be able to, I mean, in order to meet the historic context requirement, you should have to be bigger than the base zone says. So I'm just trying to check in on that to see whether, I mean, I never knew that happened anywhere in the city until I see some examples here. We basically showed that the existing structures are bigger than what's zoning for. I didn't really think through that as happening in Portland. But if it does, then there might be an argument for saying that you can build larger of those spots.
It'd be hard to write clear and objective standards related to that.
Not clear and objective anyway, because it's a landmarks district. So there's no building clear and objective anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So for whatever it's worth, I applaud the effort. I think it's striking a compromise between, and a smart compromise, not just splitting the baby like previously. In kind of our goals to definitely look at ways to increase density in these areas in a way that's thoughtful and that would be accepted by landmarks. Hopefully they're in support of this as well. Did you get feedback from them at all?
We presented some of these concepts to a joint work group with the PSC members and landmarks commissioners, and they were supportive of this approach.
Okay. So whatever it's worth, I guess I'm in support or in favor of all three of these. Are there any other comments? No? Looks like Eric really wants to jump in.
Oh, I just wanted to thank Bill for working on this. You may recall, if you were on the commission during the comp plan, that we had a lot of debate about the FAR in this district, and that went on to council. And this is a more nuanced compromise than we came up with during the comp plan.
And I would also like to acknowledge the work of Brandon Spencer Hartle, our historic resources planner, who also helped do the community outreach to really figure this out, both to Landmarks Commission as well as to the community.
I just like to comment. I mean, I appreciate the elegance of the compromise, but I'm not sure I can, as Eric said, there was a lot of discussion as to what's the right FAR in the Alphabet District. And it was ultimately decided by council a year or so ago. And I'm really uncomfortable, in effect, rezoning it now through this process. And so while I have no opinion on 2C, I'm sort of bothered by 2A and 2B for that reason. I mean, it's too bad we didn't all think of this a year or two ago. It's too bad. It's interesting that the neighborhood association's now supporting this because they think it's a better way to, zone this historic district. Too bad they didn't come up with this a year or two ago when everyone was struggling for what to do. So I think it's going to lead me to just vote no, because this was resolved a year or two ago, and it seems to me it's premature to come back now through this process. So I do appreciate it. I think on one hand it's a good idea, but for the reasons I said, I'm not going to support it, though I would support 2C.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, so since we've obviously broken it out, or Jeff has broken it out for us, let's take a vote on 2A. Raise your hand. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 2B, 7, and 2C. Looks like we've got everybody. And Teresa, did I miss you on 2A and 2B, or were you out for both of those? Okay, just want to make sure. Okay. And we are out of time. Are you you're going to beg us to do the last item?
I would like to beg you for one small item.
So I'm going to look at my fellow commissioners to make sure that they can hang in there for, I'm going to guess, knowing us, it'll be like another 10 minutes. Go ahead, Daisy.
Okay.
We still have a quorum, so go for it.
All right. The final third topic is related to FAR transfers from historic structures and seismic upgrades. Currently, you can transfer floor area that's unutilized when you have a difference between the historic scale and the base FAR of the zone. So in this example, assuming this is an historic building and you had more headroom for that you could build in the site, you could transfer that excess FAR to another site. One topic that came up is with the idea of having zoning that is more closely matches historic buildings, as you lose that potential opportunity to transfer unutilized FAR. And we took a closer look at what they did with Central City. And Central City had a special FAR transfer provision where, in conjunction with seismic upgrades to historic buildings, you're able to transfer an amount of FAR in excess of that gap between historic building scale and the base FAR. You're, in a way, given extra FAR to transfer. And because we know it's a pretty major issue that we have a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings that need to be upgraded, and it's pretty costly. In some of our discussions, we thought whether this effort could have something that helps out with that and giving more opportunity to transfer FAR and potentially earn money from that transfer. So what we're proposing is an allowance where beyond the base FAR, you could transfer an additional amount of floor area from an historic resource if that building is being seismically upgraded. And what this model is showing that additional FAR amount would be 50% of the base. So if this were showing your 2-to-1 FAR area, and you would have an unconstrained ability to transfer any excess FAR up to the base, and then you could also transfer an additional amount. If it was a 2-to-1 FAR, you could transfer a 1-to-1 FAR worth of floor area in conjunction with seismic upgrades to the building. And again, the intent being to provide some value that could help defray the cost of the seismic upgrade. And if you chose to allow this option, we'd be using regulations already in the books for Central City, and our proposal would be to provide this both for the multi-dwelling zones and the mixed-use zones outside the Central City. With that, I'll leave it to your questions and discussion.
So what happens if you transfer your FAR, you get your money, and then you never do your seismic upgrades? Did somebody track that?
There are some covenants. I'm not sure if Brandon would be able to answer the details of that, but there are legal requirements attached to this code option.
Brandon Spencer Hurdle, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We worked through that question specifically in the Central City Plan, working closely with Bureau of Development Services and how they implement their phase seismic agreements. And the way it would work here is exactly like it would work there, that a property owner who had not completed a seismic upgrade that met a minimum life safety standard would enter into that phased agreement with Bureau of Development Services that over a specified number of years that upgrade would take place, and if not, there would be an enforcement issue against that property owner for not having met that standard, and that would be enforced by Bureau of Development Services.
I guess the question, how about the recipient of the FAR?
As I understand it,
someone got that FAR, and the person who sold it didn't do the upgrades.
It's not
not
their fault.
Well, I know it's not their fault, but
is there understand that once the transaction has taken place, that receiving site owner then has the FAR and is off the hook?
They don't have any cloud over that FAR. Okay.
That's my understanding. Once the transfer is completed, the transfer is completed.
It would need to be that, yeah. And the seismic upgrades defined?
It is. In Title 24 of our building regulations for the minimum standard.
You'd very likely have the new FAR already built before the seismic upgrade would happen in a lot of cases. So, because it could be a really complicated renovation, let's say, right? And then the new FAR is already built in the meantime. Or the transferred FAR, the new project it went to. Any other questions, comments? All those in favor of this proposal, raise your hand. And that is unanimous for those present. Thank you.
All right. The only other thing I want to mention is just
no.
what's coming up. So our next session is April 30th.
I haven't adjourned us, folks.
On April 30th, we will be having deliberations and any additional amendments to what we have in the revised proposed draft. And we hope to have at least a vote on a recommendation. And to get us there, by next Tuesday, April 16th, we're asking that you provide us with your requests for any additional amendments. And that would give us some time to work up code language based on what you're asking. So that's your homework. By next Tuesday, please share with us any requests for additional amendments.
Thank you very much. With that, we're adjourned.